What if everything you think you know about human history is missing a chapter? Not a small one, not a footnote. A chapter so big it might explain every flood myth, every prophecy of ending worlds, every legend of a golden age destroyed by fire or water or ice. Here's the question that keeps researchers awake at night. What if this isn't the first time human civilization has climbed this high? What if we're not the first species of humans to build cities, to develop writing, to gaze up at the stars and think we understood the universe? What if, somewhere in the deep past, civilizations rose to heights we can barely imagine, and then vanished, not slowly faded, but reset, wiped clean, leaving behind nothing but scattered stones, strange symbols and stories that got passed down so many times we stopped believing they were memories at all? Think about it. Almost every culture on Earth, separated by oceans, mountains, thousands of years, tells some version of the same story. A great flood, a world destroyed, survivors who carried knowledge forward to rebuild everything from scratch. The Hindus call it the cycle of Yugas, ages of gold sliding down into ages of darkness. The Hopi speak of 4 worlds already destroyed, with a 5th now teetering on the edge. The Aztecs counted 5 suns, 5 attempts at creation, 4 of them ending in catastrophe. The Egyptians whispered about Tepi the first time, a golden age so distant even their oldest records treated it as ancient history. Coincidence, maybe. Cultures make up similar stories all the time. But what if it's not coincidence? What if these aren't just myths borrowed and passed between neighbouring tribes? What if they're memories, fragments of something real, encoded in story because story is the only thing that survives when everything else burns, floods, or crumbles to dust? This is where the idea of the 7th civilization comes in. Not 7 as in some exact historical count we can prove with carbon dating and ruins. 7 as a thread, a number that shows up again and again in flood legends, in creation myths, in prophecy after prophecy, almost like a signature left behind by something we haven't fully identified yet. Some traditions count 6 worlds already gone, with ours as the 7th. Others frame it differently, but the pattern of repetition, destruction, rebirth, repetition again, that pattern shows up everywhere. And once you start looking for it, you can't stop seeing it. So that's what this is about. Not proving with absolute certainty that Atlantis was real or that ancient astronauts built the pyramids. This is about something more careful, more curious, looking at the actual evidence, the mythology, the geology, the archaeology, and asking an honest question. What if civilization really has been reset before? And if it has, what would still be here now? What fragments would have survived every collapse, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to notice them? Before we go further, I want to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Drop it in the comments, your city, your country, and what time it is right there where you are. I read every single one, and it genuinely amazes me. Tokyo at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, all listening to the same story about the same deep past we apparently share. And if you want more of these long, slow-burn deep dives, the easiest way to support the channel costs you nothing. Just follow the show on Spotify. The link is right there in the description. It helps more than you'd think, because here's the promise for tonight. We're going to trace this thread all the way back, through flood myths and star maps, through temples older than agriculture itself, through numbers and symbols repeated across cultures that never should have known about each other. We're going to ask what survived every reset and where it's still hiding, quietly, right here in the world we call modern. Here's something modern history books rarely tell you. For most of human existence, nobody believed time moved in a straight line. Think about how we're taught to see history today. A timeline. Cavemen on the left, skyscrapers on the right, one continuous march of progress connecting the two. Stone tools to bronze tools to iron tools to steam engines to smartphones. Up and to the right, always improving, never looping back. It's such a basic assumption that most of us never even question it. Of course history moves forward. Of course things generally get better, more advanced, more complex over time. That's just how history works. Except that's not how most of our ancestors saw it. Not even close. For the vast majority of cultures across the vast majority of human history, time wasn't a line. It was a wheel. History didn't march forward towards some inevitable destination. It turned and turned and turned again, cycling through ages of light and ages of darkness, creation and destruction, golden ages and catastrophic collapse, over and over, endlessly. This isn't some fringe belief held by one isolated tribe in one forgotten corner of the world. This is arguably the dominant framework through which humans understood their own existence for thousands of years. And it shows up in places that make absolutely no sense if you assume these ideas just spread from one culture to another through trade or contact. Picture the ancient Hindus sitting in the Indus Valley, developing an intricate cosmology of 4 ages, the Yugas, cycling from a golden age of truth and virtue down through progressively darker ages until everything collapses and begins again. Now picture the Hopi people, thousands of miles away, isolated on mesas in what's now the American Southwest, with absolutely no contact with Vedic India, describing 4 worlds that already ended in destruction, with a 5th now hanging in the balance. Now picture the Aztecs, an ocean away from both, independently developing at a completely different time in history, counting 5 suns, 5 attempts by the gods to create a stable world, 4 of which ended catastrophically. 3 cultures, 3 continents, no contact between them whatsoever, separated sometimes by oceans, sometimes by thousands of years. And yet they all arrived at strikingly similar conclusions. The world has ended before. It will probably end again. And we are living somewhere in the middle of that repeating cycle, not at the beginning, and maybe not that far from the end. Add the Egyptians into the mix, and things get even stranger. Egyptian priests spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, a mythical golden age when the gods themselves walked the earth and established the fundamental order of the universe. Here's what's interesting. Even to the ancient Egyptians, Zep Tepi was already ancient history. We're talking about a civilization that built the pyramids, that gave us some of the oldest written records on Earth, and even they looked back at their own deep past and described a golden age so distant that it existed almost outside of normal time altogether. And then there's the Greeks, sitting at the crossroads of the Mediterranean world, developing their own version of the same idea almost independently. Hesiod, writing around the 8th century BCE, described 5 ages of humanity: a golden age of peace and abundance, a silver age of decline, a bronze age of violence, a heroic age that briefly interrupted the downward slide, and finally an iron age of suffering and struggle, which Hesiod believed he himself was living through. Sound familiar? It should. It's structurally almost identical to what the Hindus were describing on the other side of the world. So here's the question that should be bothering you right now. How does this happen? How do cultures separated by mountains, oceans, and millennia all land on essentially the same story? Not just a vague similarity, but a specific structured belief. Cyclical time, multiple ages, golden pasts, catastrophic endings, renewal. There are a few possible explanations, and we should be honest about all of them. Maybe it's coincidence, human minds independently arriving at similar metaphors because we all watch the sun rise and set, the seasons cycle, the moon wax and wane, Cyclical thinking might just be the natural output of a species that lives embedded in cyclical natural rhythms. That's a reasonable, scientifically grounded explanation, and we shouldn't dismiss it. But there's another possibility, one that's harder to prove and easier to dismiss, but strangely difficult to fully rule out either. What if these cultures aren't independently inventing the same metaphor? What if they're independently remembering the same events? What if buried underneath the mythology, underneath the gods and the symbolic language, there's an actual memory being passed down, generation after generation, reshaped by storytelling but never fully erased? A memory of something that really happened, something catastrophic, something that ended a version of the world that came before ours. And here's where things get even stranger, because buried inside almost all of these traditions, there's a number that keeps showing up with suspicious consistency. 7. Not always explicitly, not in every single tradition in exactly the same way, but close enough, often enough, that once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. 7 days of creation, 7 heavens, 7 worlds. Traditions that count 6 ages already gone, with the current one being the 7th. It shows up in creation myths and destruction myths alike, almost like a fingerprint left behind by whatever original event, or events, these stories are trying to describe. Is it meaningful? Is it coincidence? Honestly, at this point in the investigation, we don't know for certain, and anyone who tells you they do is probably selling something. But it's exactly the kind of pattern that deserves a closer look rather than a dismissive shrug. So that's where we're headed next, into the specific traditions themselves. The Hindu Yugas and their intricate mathematics of cosmic time. The Hopi prophecy of 4 worlds and the 5th now unfolding. The Aztec suns destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire and flood. The Egyptian first time and its strange, persistent echoes, each one a piece of a puzzle that spans the entire globe. Each one asking the same unsettling question in its own unique language. What if this really has happened before? If you want to understand just how seriously some ancient cultures took this idea of repeating ages, you have to start with the Hindu Yugas. Because this isn't just a vague story about a golden age and a fall from grace. This is an entire cosmology built on precise cycles, ratios and timescales, so enormous they make our entire written history look like a blip. In the Hindu view, time is not only cyclical, it's structured. The basic unit is the Mahayuga, the Great Age, made up of 4 yugas that always come in the same order. The first is Satya Yuga, sometimes called Krita Yuga. This is the Golden Age. Satya literally means truth, and that's the defining quality of this era. Dharma, the cosmic order, righteousness, the right way of living is said to stand on 4 legs like a perfectly balanced table. In Satya Yuga, people live long lives. Minds are clear. Spiritual understanding comes naturally. The texts describe humanity as truthful, compassionate, and almost effortlessly connected to the divine. There's no need for elaborate rituals or complex laws because nobody is really breaking them. It's a world where the spiritual software is running at 100%, with no bugs. Then the cycle starts to slip. The second age is Treta Yuga. Dharma now stands on 3 legs instead of 4. Still stable, but not perfect. This is an age of heroes and great works. Many of the events in the Ramayana, one of India's great epic stories, are said to take place in Treta Yuga. You still have high spiritual knowledge, sages, and advanced understanding, but ego, conflict, and hierarchy have entered the picture. People begin to need guidance, scriptures, rituals, rules to stay aligned with truth. The light is still bright, but there are shadows now. Next comes Dvapara Yuga, the third age. Dharma is down to 2 legs. Half of the original stability is gone. The Mahabharata, with its vast war and moral complexity, is placed here by traditional chronology. In Devapara, the texts say, virtue and vice are evenly mixed. Lifespans shorten. Spiritual understanding is no longer intuitive. It has to be taught and protected. Knowledge exists, but it's fragmented. You start seeing specialized roles. Warrior castes, priestly castes, merchant castes, each pursuing their own interests. Technically, society can become very sophisticated in this age, but the inner cohesion, the shared sense of meaning is breaking down. And then there's Kali Yuga, the fourth and final age in the cycle. This is the one we're supposedly in right now. Kali here doesn't mean the goddess Kali, but strife, discord. Dharma is said to stand on just one leg. Barely balanced, wobbling, almost ready to collapse. Texts like the Vishnu Purana and the Bhagavata Purana describe Kali Yuga in terms that feel uncomfortably modern. Greed elevated above ethics, rulers who exploit rather than protect, spiritual teachers who sell their teachings, families fragmenting, the natural environment degrading, truth treated as relative, everything up for sale. People become, in the language of the texts, short-lived, weak in understanding, and unfortunate, not just physically, but morally and spiritually. Now, obviously this is mythology. It's a moral narrative, not a peer-reviewed sociological study. But notice the pattern. This isn't random chaos. It's a structured decline. 4 ages, each one marked by a progressive loss of something essential. The number that shows up over and over in this framework is 4, but the logic underneath it is fractional. Satya Yuga has 4-4 of Dharma. Treta has 3-4. Devapara has 2-4. Kali has 1-4. In other words, it's not just things get worse over time, it's the foundation gets systematically removed, one leg at a time. And here's where it ties directly into our question about resets. In Hindu cosmology, a yuga doesn't just fade into the next one. Each age ends in a period of dissolution and upheaval. The Sanskrit word is pralaya, a kind of unravelling. Not always total cosmic annihilation, but a breaking down of the old order so thoroughly that a new order can arise. On the largest scale, there are vast cycles where entire universes are created, preserved, and dissolved. On the human scale, the yugas are nested within those greater cycles like gears inside bigger gears. But the principle is the same. Stability, decline, collapse, renewal, over and over. In many tellings, the end of Kali Yuga, the age of maximum confusion, is not just doom for doom's sake. It's the necessary clearing operation before Satya Yuga returns. Like a forest fire that looks like pure destruction from the ground, but from a longer perspective, resets the ecosystem for new growth. This isn't a one-time apocalypse, it's maintenance on a cosmic scale. The timescales involved are where Hindu cosmology really breaks our modern sense of proportion. Depending on the tradition and how you do the math, a full cycle of 4 yugas, a Maha Yuga, is said to last 4.32 million years. 1,000 of those is a day of Brahma, the creator god, followed by a night of equal length where the universe rests. Even if we treat these numbers as symbolic rather than literal, the point is clear. Humanity is not at the center of the story. We're a recurring feature inside an unimaginably vast repeating pattern. From that vantage point, civilization as we define it, 10,000 years of agriculture and city building, is almost nothing. A tiny late-stage detail in a much older script. In some interpretations of the Yuga system, there have already been countless cycles before this one, with civilizations rising to heights we can't imagine, then vanishing so completely that only hints and archetypes leak through into myth. And that's where something very interesting appears. The role of preserved knowledge. In the Yuga framework, divine knowledge doesn't reset to zero every time the cosmic wheel turns. Instead, it's periodically restored through figures known as avatars and rishis, incarnations and sages. Vishnu, the preserver deity, is said to take birth again and again in different forms to re-establish Dharma when it decays. In Satya Yuga, knowledge is open, ambient, everywhere. By Kali Yuga, it's rare, hidden, guarded, preserved in esoteric traditions, secret lineages, and texts that only a few can read correctly. It's a very particular way of answering the question, if the world keeps ending, how does anything important survive? The Hindu answer is not technology survives or build a bunker. It's certain patterns of knowledge, certain ways of seeing reality are carried across the breakpoints by a small number of highly trained or divinely inspired beings. The universe in this view is not just wiping the slate clean each time. It's curating a library. If you strip away the religious language and just look at the structure, it's eerily similar to the scenario we started with. Tiny scattered populations preserving crucial survival skills through a long crisis, then exploding outward when conditions improve. Except here, the survival skills are metaphysical, how to live in alignment with cosmic law, how to rebuild a functional civilization after the last one burned down. And what about us? Where does all of this place the present moment? Traditional calculations in many Hindu schools say we're deep into Kali Yuga. Some date its beginning to around 3100 BCE, roughly when the earliest large civilizations we recognize, Sumer, the Indus Valley, were emerging. If that's even approximately accurate, then everything we call history has unfolded inside a single dark age, an era defined not by our greatest achievements, but by operating at a severe spiritual and moral deficit compared to earlier cycles. Now, do we have to take that literally? No. It can be read symbolically as a critique of human nature, a way of saying, once you move away from a simple integrated life, once ego and power and technology outrun wisdom, you start sliding into a world that feels like Kali Yuga, whether or not the stars line up. But symbol or not, the themes attached to this age are familiar. Environmental breakdown, social fragmentation, widespread cynicism, leaders who seem less and less trustworthy, constant information, but less and less wisdom. The Yuga model doesn't just predict things get bad at the end. It predicts that right before a reset, confusion spikes. You get maximum noise, minimum signal. Everything accelerates and destabilizes. And buried in those same texts is a second, quieter message, that even in Kali Yuga, tiny pockets of preserved knowledge remain. Lineages, practices, symbols, and teachings that act like seeds waiting for the next Satya Yuga to germinate fully. Not everyone makes it through the reset. Not every structure deserves to. But some things do survive. Some things are designed to. Which raises a very pointed question for us. Here and now, living in a civilization that increasingly feels like it's pushing up against its own limits. If the Hindus were right about these cycles, even metaphorically, what exactly is being carried through the fire this time? And who, if anyone, is doing the carrying? To get a better grip on that, we need to step away from the Ganges and cross an ocean, to another people who also say we're not living in the first version of this world. According to them, we're already on our fourth try, and the fifth one is not guaranteed. When you sit with Hopi elders and listen, really listen, you discover they're talking about something uncannily similar to the Yugas, but from a completely different angle. To the Hopi, this isn't abstract cosmology, it's family history. In Hopi tradition, we are not living in the first version of the world. We are in the fourth world now, with a fifth on the horizon. The previous worlds weren't just other dimensions. They were stages of existence, each with its own way of living, each destroyed when humanity lost its balance. Different mesas, different elders, different clans tell the story with slightly different details, but the backbone is consistent. In the first world, people lived close to their creator, following simple instructions in harmony with nature. It was a kind of innocence, not a high-tech golden age, but a state of obedience and balance. Over time, though, humans began to forget. They misused the powers given to them, turned away from the spiritual laws, and started living only for themselves. The catastrophe that ended that world is often described in elemental terms. Fire from above, fire from below, the world burning. Some versions speak of the earth being scorched, others of volcanic fire and a tilting planet. However you frame it, the message is clear. When humans abuse the gifts of life, the very element that sustains them, energy, heat, power, turned on them. The first world was destroyed by fire. A handful of people survived. Here's where the Hopi story does something very unusual. The survivors aren't saved in a spaceship or an ark. They go down before they go up. They retreat into the earth, into what is sometimes called the underworld, or into subterranean ant people cities in some popular retellings, though that part is less universally emphasized by traditional elders than modern books make it seem. The core idea is ascent through levels, from those refuge places, guided by spiritual beings. The survivors climb, through openings, through Sisyphus, through portals, into a second world. That second world begins well, as they all do. People are warned, remember what happened before. Live humbly. Keep the ceremonies, respect the land. For a while they do, but as time passes, corruption returns. People become obsessed with material things, with power over others. They forget the instructions. This time the world freezes. Descriptions speak of ice and great cold, of the world covered and made uninhabitable. Again the pattern, an element that sustains life, water, in its frozen form, the climate itself, becomes the instrument of reset. The second world is destroyed by ice. Again, not everyone dies. Those who remembered the original teachings, who kept their promises to the Creator, are guided to safety. They descend, pass through an opening, and emerge into a third world. Now things get more complex. In many Hopi tellings, the third world is more advanced. People develop greater skills, more sophisticated ways of living. They build cities, travel, gain power. The problem is not technology in itself, but what it does to their hearts. Pride grows. People use knowledge for selfish and destructive purposes. They fight, exploit, forget the spiritual laws that made life possible. In this world, the warning is explicit. If you do not live in harmony, this world too will end. When it finally does, the dominant image is water. Some tellings speak of great waves, others of a deluge covering the land, others of the whole world being rolled in water. Fire, ice, then flood. 3 elemental resets for 3 ages of forgetting. The echoes with global flood stories are hard to miss, but in the Hopi context, it isn't just disaster porn. It's moral architecture. Each destruction is a consequence of broken relationship, with the earth, with each other, with the unseen. The pattern of survival repeats. A remnant, those who have held to the old ways, are led out of danger. They journey underground or across watery expanses, and eventually they emerge through a small opening in the earth, the Sipapu, into the land that will become the centre of the fourth world. For the Hopi, that Sipapu is not theoretical, it's a specific place, still revered, still woven into ceremony. From there, they spread out, migrate, mark the land with petroglyphs and sacred sites, and crucially they carry with them instructions how to live in this new world so it does not end like the last 3. That's the world we're in now according to Hopi tradition, the fourth world. And it too comes with conditions. Hopi prophecy says this world will stand only as long as humans uphold their covenant. The themes will sound familiar. Don't forget the spiritual laws. Don't let greed and division rule. Don't disrupt the balance of nature. There are specific prophecy elements that some Hopi elders have linked to modern events. A gourd of ashes that falls from the sky and makes the rivers boil, often associated with nuclear explosions, a web spun over the world, which many interpret as global communications, roads in the sky and iron horses, red as airplanes and trains. The details are debated, and it's important not to force a one-to-one match for every modern technology. But the overall shape is unmistakable. A vision of a world speeding up, filling with powerful tools and deep confusion, approaching a choice point. Some versions of the prophecy say we stand at a forked path. If we continue in imbalance, war, environmental destruction, spiritual amnesia, the fourth world will be purified, violently if necessary, and ended. If we correct course, remember the original instructions, and restore balance, the transition can be gentler. Either way, the change is coming. The question is how much has to burn, freeze, or flood before we learn. And hovering in the background is the idea of the fifth world. Not a spaceship escape, not a digital upload, but another level of existence open to those who keep faith with the teachings. Some Hopi elders describe it as a world of greater harmony, where humans finally learn to live in a way that doesn't require yet another elemental reset. Others are more cautious, saying only that another world will come, and that the seeds of it are being prepared now in the hearts and practices of those who remember. How has this entire multi-world narrative survived, across centuries of droughts, invasions, forced schooling, and cultural suppression? Not in books, in people, in clans, kivas, ceremonies, songs, and long nights of storytelling where elders pour the memory of previous worlds into the ears of children. It's oral tradition functioning exactly the way those bottleneck populations did in our evolutionary story, scattered, pressured, sometimes on the edge of extinction, but somehow keeping a core pattern alive. And once again, what gets saved is not a blueprint for a machine, but a way of living, a diagnosis of how worlds die, and a prescription for how not to kill the next one. Across an ocean from the Hindu sages, on high mesas in the American Southwest, you find another culture saying, "This is not the first time, and it won't be the last." Worlds come and go. A few remember why. If we want to know whether anything truly important can survive repeated collapses, we have to keep following that pattern, from the Hopi mesas down into the Valley of Mexico, where yet another people counted not 4, but 5 destroyed suns. In the high valley where Mexico City now drowns in concrete and smog, the Mexica, the people we call Aztecs, looked back and saw not one world, not 4, but 5. Not metaphorical errors in the modern sense, but actual suns, actual creations, each with a sky, a people, and a destiny, each ending in catastrophe. In the stories recorded shortly after the Spanish conquest, the universe doesn't just begin once. It begins, fails, and begins again. The first sun is called Nahui Ocelotl 4 Jaguar. In that age, the world is populated by giant beings, sometimes described as powerful, but also arrogant, out of balance with the order the gods intended. The gods decide that this version of creation isn't working. The reset button isn't a polite transition, it's teeth and claws. Jaguars appear and devour the people of that world. Creation ends in being eaten by the very forces of nature you can't control. The second sun is Nahui Ehekatl, 4 wind. Humanity is recreated, the world is restored, but the lesson of humility doesn't stick. Again, people grow corrupt, forget their obligations to the gods, exploit the gifts of the earth. This time the element of destruction is the air itself. A great wind rises, a cosmic hurricane that tears the world apart. People are blown away, transformed into monkeys in some versions, reduced, made foolish, stripped of their former dignity. Intelligence without balance becomes mockery. Then comes the third sun, Nahui Kuyohuitl, for rain, but not a gentle rain, rain of fire. This is an age when, again, human beings fail the test. The sky opens and burning stones, fiery debris, flaming resin fall from above. Think of volcanic ash, meteors, or simply the weaponized image of the heavens turned hostile. The land is scorched, people burn or are transformed into birds to escape. The message, the power that nourishes crops and warms bodies can, when the balance is broken, become the agent of annihilation. The fourth sun is Nahui Attel, for water. You already know what's coming. This is the flood world. After another failed cycle of human behavior, the gods drown creation. The seas rise. The rain does not stop. Everything is submerged. Survivors are turned into fish in some tellings. Another element that sustains life, water, becomes the instrument of reset. Fire from above, wind, fire rain, then flood. 4 elemental endings, 4 destroyed worlds. If you're hearing echoes of the Hopi worlds or the Hindu Yugas, you're not alone. Different language, different geography, same basic pattern. Repeated creations, moral decline, elemental catastrophe, a remnant, a restart. But the Aztec version adds a layer that's both beautiful and brutal. None of these suns exist without divine sacrifice. In their cosmology, the gods themselves bleed to keep the universe running. At the end of the earlier suns, the divine council has to decide, will there be another world at all? Will time continue? And if so, who will pay the price to set it in motion? At Teotihuacan, which the Aztecs treated as an ancient sacred city long before archaeologists did, the gods gather around a great fire to create the fifth sun. 2 deities step forward. One is proud, richly adorned. The other is humble, sickly, covered in sores. Both are told, you must leap into the flames. You must die so that the new sun can rise. The proud one hesitates. The humble one jumps. Only then, shamed, does the proud god follow. Their bodies burn, their hearts fuel the heavens, and a new sun appears. But it just sits there, weak, barely moving. The universe is not complete, so the other gods have to do something unthinkable. They cut their own chests open, offer their blood, their hearts. Only through this collective sacrifice does the sun begin to move. The wind starts to blow, time starts to flow. In the Aztec view, the cosmos is not a free gift. It is an ongoing expenditure of life. And that brings us to the age we're living in now, in their system. The fifth sun, Nahui Olin, 4 movement. Olin means movement, earthquake, upheaval. From the start, this sun is predicted to end not in jaguars or wind or flame or water, but in motion itself, the ground shaking, the world shifting beneath our feet. In some interpretations, this means literal earthquakes and crustal disruptions. In others, it's more symbolic, a world defined by constant change, instability, volatility, and eventually a terminal convulsion. For the Aztecs, this wasn't a distant mythic someday. It was a present tense problem. The fifth sun requires continual feeding to keep moving across the sky. That's the theological frame behind their infamous human sacrifices. Blood and hearts offered to sustain the sun, the seasons, the very existence of time. You can read that as simple imperial ideology, and there is definitely politics in it. But under the horror, there's a world view. Everything that exists is precarious. Every age is temporary, and even gods must give something up to keep the story going. Structurally, the parallels with the Hopi Four Worlds and the Hindu Yugas are hard to ignore. A sequence of ages. Each age morally degenerates. The cosmos responds with elemental catastrophe: fire, air, fire again, water, then predicted upheaval. Humanity does not simply progress in a straight line. It cycles, forgets, falls, and is forced to start over. But there's a distinct Mesoamerican twist. They didn't just talk about these cycles, they built their entire timekeeping system around them. The Aztec calendar isn't one calendar, but interlocking cycles. The 260-day ritual count, the 365-day solar year, larger bundles of years, and mythic cycles of suns layered on top. Every day has a name, a sign, a destiny, plugged into a cosmic fabric that says you're living in a particular slice of a much bigger rhythm. This pattern isn't only written in manuscripts like the Codex Borbonicus. It's carved into stone, into the famous calendar stone, more accurately a sunstone, with the face of the fifth sun at the centre, surrounded by the glyphs of the 4 previous destroyed worlds. Why encode a story of repeated annihilation into your calendars and monuments? Why centre the symbol of your empire on a god whose tongue is a sacrificial blade, and whose eyes stare from the middle of a wheel of destroyed ages? One answer is control. If you know the cycles, you can prepare. Priests can time rituals, rulers can claim divine mandate, society can be organized around keeping the sun moving just a little bit longer. Another answer is memory. When the landscape itself bears the record of previous worlds, floodplains, volcanic fields, shattered mountains, cultures like the Mexica may have chosen to inscribe that memory into stone and story, to make sure no one forgets that worlds end. And just like with the Hopi and the Hindu sages, the subtext is not simply doom. It's responsibility. This fifth sun is unstable, dangerous, prone to upheaval, but it still depends on human choices. Forget the pattern, and the reset comes hard. Remember it, and maybe you can ride out the tremors into whatever comes next. When you put these 3 systems side by side, Yugas in India, worlds on Hopi mesas, suns in the Valley of Mexico, you start to see not just isolated myths, but a shared intuition. History is not a straight road. It's a wheel. The real question becomes, is that wheel just a psychological comfort? Or is it telling us something about real cycles in nature and civilization? To explore that, we have to leave mythology for a moment and listen to another ancient voice, one carved deep into the bedrock of Egyptian time. The Egyptians had a word for that bedrock of time: Zep Tepi. Literally the first time. Not just a long time ago, but a qualitatively different era. The age when the gods themselves walked the earth, established order, laid out the template for everything that came after. In Egyptian temple texts, Zep Tepi isn't vague nostalgia. It's treated like a specific reference point. The gods raised the primordial mound out of the dark waters of chaos, none. They found the first city, plant the first pillar, perform the first rituals. Every later act, every coronation, every temple dedication, every sacred festival is meaningful only because it repeats, or tries to repeat, what was done in the first time. That phrase shows up again and again in inscriptions, according to what was done in the first time. A king doesn't just build a temple, he restores it to its Zep Tepi pattern. A priest doesn't just recite words, he speaks the formulae as in the first time. The message is clear. Legitimacy comes from continuity with something unimaginably old. And here's the twist. The Egyptians, especially in the later dynasties, did not see themselves as the first civilization. They saw themselves as inheritors and restorers. On temple walls at Abydos, at Edfu, at Philae, you find king lists and mythic histories that stretch far beyond the human pharaohs we know from textbooks. Before Menes, Narmer, before the First Dynasty, you get the followers of Horus, the Shemsu Hor, semi-divine rulers who reigned in an age when gods and humans overlapped. In the Turin King List, a fragmentary papyrus, you literally have columns of gods and spirits listed as kings of Egypt before the historical dynasties begin. To the Egyptian scribes who copied these lists, this wasn't fantasy in the modern sense. It was prehistory, a remembered succession of god-kings and demigods whose reigns sometimes spanned thousands of years each. After them come the spirits of the dead, then, finally, mortal kings with more human lifespans. Whether those time spans are symbolic or not, the structure tells you how they thought. There was a real ordered world before ours, governed by beings closer to the divine pattern. What we call ancient Egypt saw itself as late. You see the same idea encoded in temple texts like the so-called Edfu building texts. They describe an earlier island of the egg, a primordial homeland destroyed by catastrophe, where the first temples were built by the gods themselves. Survivors, called the builder gods, sail out and reconstruct those original shrines in new locations, following heavenly plans preserved from Zep Tepi, to a modern eye that reads almost like a mythologized memory of some older culture, wiped out and partially recreated along the Nile. To more cautious scholars, it's symbolic theology, the gods as archetypal architects, every human temple a copy of a celestial blueprint. Either way, the pattern is restoration, not invention. Then there's the sky. For decades, researchers have argued that key Egyptian monuments are deliberately locked to specific astronomical events, not just to the everyday sun, but to something like a cosmic timestamp. The most famous example is the alignment of the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx. Some engineers and archaeoastronomers have pointed out that the three main pyramids mirror the belt stars of Orion, an asterism associated in Egypt with Osiris, lord of the dead and ruler of the afterlife. Others have noted that the Sphinx, with its leonine body, faces due east, staring at the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the spring equinox. If you roll the sky back using precession, that 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis we'll talk about later, some researchers claim there's a fit around 10,500 BCE, when the sun in the spring equinox rose in the constellation of Leo and Orion, sat at a specific angle relative to Giza's latitude. In that model, the whole plateau is like a frozen clock, pointing back not to the Old Kingdom, but to some much earlier first time. Is that ironclad science? No. Many Egyptologists argue the alignments are overinterpreted, that the pyramids are products of the 3rd millennium BCE and nothing more. The debate is ongoing, but the very fact that it's plausible to read these structures as skylocked memory devices is telling, especially in a culture obsessed with Zep Tepi, with ritually returning to the first time. Because once you step back and look at the pattern, Egypt starts to sound a lot like the other traditions we've already met. An age of the gods, a golden template, catastrophically interrupted. Later ages defined as attempts to re-establish that lost order. Kings ruling not as innovators, but as caretakers of a design handed down from before history. Monuments possibly aligned not just to the present sky, but to some earlier celestial configuration. Whether you take the conservative view that this is all theology and symbolism, or the more radical one that fragments of a pre-civilization source culture were preserved along the Nile, the Egyptians are clearly participating in the same intuition. We are living in a sequel. Zep Tepi is their name for the world before the reset, and that raises a new question. If the Egyptians were dimly remembering an earlier age, and if the Aztecs, the Hopi and the sages of India were doing something similar in their own languages, what actually happened between that first time and ours? Across cultures, one answer keeps surfacing, sometimes literally: water. To follow that thread, we have to plunge into the oldest, most widespread catastrophe story of all, the flood. When you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Not just in one region, not just in one religious tradition, from the ancient cities between the Tigris and Euphrates, to the hills of Greece, to the river valleys of China, to the plains and coastlines of the Americas, you keep running into the same core story. Once, the world was destroyed by water. In Mesopotamia, it's Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or Ziusudra in even older Sumerian traditions. The gods decide humans are noisy, chaotic, out of control. They send a storm so violent it rips the sky. But one man receives a warning from a god who still cares. Tear down your house and build a boat. Load it with the seed of all living creatures. The flood comes, wipes out almost everyone. The boat grounds on a mountain. Birds are released to find dry land. A sacrifice is offered. A new covenant is made. Centuries later in the Hebrew Bible, the names have changed, but the outline hasn't. Humanity has become corrupt. God decides to wipe the slate clean. One righteous man, Noah, is told to build an ark. Take your family, take the animals, preserve life. The waters rise, covering even the mountains. When the ark finally rests, a dove is sent out, returns with an olive leaf. A rainbow appears as a sign that this particular reset won't be done this way again. In Greece, Zeus plays the role of the displeased god. Humans have degenerated. The pious are few. He sends a deluge. Only Deucalion and Pyrrha survive in a chest or boat, after being warned by Prometheus. When the waters recede, they repopulate the world by throwing the bones of their mother, stones of the earth, over their shoulders, which become new humans. Different imagery, same function. A tiny remnant carries forward the human story. Cross the continent to China and you find Yu the Great. The older myths speak of a chaotic flood that covers the land for years, drowning fields, swallowing villages. Yu is tasked not to ride out the water, but to tame it, to dredge channels, cut new riverbeds, guide the deluge back into order. He becomes the founder of a dynasty, the origin point of legitimate rule. Again, water as cosmic punishment, then one figure who learns how to live with it and pass on that knowledge. Go even farther to indigenous peoples of the Americas, and the pattern doesn't break. Many First Nations along the Pacific Northwest tell of a great flood where people survive by fastening canoes to mountain tops, or to tall trees, or by following instructions from spirit beings on how to build a special vessel. In Mesoamerica, some Maya accounts speak of earlier creations washed away. In parts of South America, there are stories of a lone couple floating in a hollowed log, guided to safety, then instructed by a culture bringer on how to plant, how to build, how to begin again. If you strip these stories down to their bones, the same elements keep repeating. A world that has gone wrong or grown loud or forgotten its proper order. A decision by higher powers, gods, a single deity, or the living earth itself, to reset the system with water. A warning given to a tiny minority. One person, one family, a small group. A vessel, ark, chest, canoe, floating mountain, safe enclosure. Animals, seeds, or the essence of all living things preserved inside. Waters rising high enough to erase what came before. Then a landing, a mountain top, a new shore, the sending out of birds or scouts. A sacrifice, a promise, a new law. Humanity 2.0. So how do you explain that? Scholars have been arguing about it for more than a century. One camp says this is diffusion, a very old story born in one culture, often assumed to be Mesopotamia, with its documented floods and its very ancient texts that spread outward along trade routes and migrations, morphing as it went. Another camp points out that floods are simply common and terrifying. Any river valley civilization, any coastal community, will eventually experience a devastating flood. They don't need to borrow the story from anyone, they will generate it on their own. In that view, the convergences are just convergences. Humans everywhere live next to water, depend on it, and fear it. Of course they imagine gods using it as a weapon. But there's a third possibility, less tidy and harder to test, that behind the mythic floods there were real, region-shaping cataclysms, not just local river floods, but events on a scale that could haunt a culture for thousands of years. We know from standard geology that at the end of the last ice age sea levels rose by more than 100 meters as the great ice sheets melted. That didn't happen overnight, but it also didn't happen gently. There were pulses, centuries where the ocean shoreline crept inland year by year, swallowing coastal plains, estuaries, and the mouths of great rivers. Land that had been home to generations was drowned in the lifetime of a grandparent. Entire ecosystems disappeared underwater. There are also traces of more violent regional events. Massive glacial lakes suddenly emptying when their ice dams failed, sending walls of water racing downstream, possible tsunami deposits along ancient coasts. Mainstream researchers still debate the scale and timing of these floods, but no one disputes that the end of the Ice Age was a time when water was on the move. Imagine being part of a culture that lived through that. You wouldn't remember it as a slow statistical curve on a graph. You'd remember the year the sea took the fishing camp. The storm that tore away the old village and never really receded. The elders pointing at the waves and saying, "Our grandparents walked out there." Give that a few hundred generations, filter it through ritual and story, and you can see how a memory of real water might harden into mythic water. A historical trauma becomes a cosmic reset, and in those reset stories there's always the question, what makes it through? Notice what is saved in almost every version. It isn't gold. It isn't palaces, it's lineages, instructions, and patterns. In Mesopotamia, the flood hero preserves not just animals, but the knowledge of how to offer sacrifice, how to speak to the gods. In the Bible, Noah's family carries a covenant, a set of commands, and a promise that structures all later history. In Greek accounts, Deucalion and Pyrrha don't just repopulate the earth, they inherit the memory of what went wrong before. In some indigenous traditions, the survivors are given songs, stories, and rituals by spirit beings after the water recedes, a starter kit for culture in the New World. Chinese legends of Yu the Great emphasize techniques, how to dig channels, how to map the land, how to govern. Again and again, what survives the flood is some combination of bloodline and blueprint. A chosen family, a sacred chest of objects, a set of tablets, a basket of seeds, a repertoire of stories, something that can be unfolded gradually to rebuild a shattered world according to a pattern that supposedly predates the catastrophe. Which starts to sound very familiar, because if the Yugas, the Hopi Worlds, the Aztec Suns, and Tepi are all telling us that history runs in cycles, creation, corruption, destruction, restoration, then the flood is the narrative hinge. The moment the old world is wiped, the slate is washed, and a tiny packet of continuity is ferried across the abyss. The question is that packet just mythic, a symbol of human resilience, or is it preserving hints of real things that made it through? Real knowledge, real traditions, maybe even fragments of a civilization older than the one we call the first. To follow that trail, we have to look at one of the most famous flood stories of all, the one that has shaped Western imagination for 2,000 years, and ask whether it, too, might be remembering more than we think. That's where Plato and his drowned island enter the story. Plato puts the whole thing in the mouth of someone else. In the dialogue Timaeus, he has the statesman Critias tell a story he says came from his grandfather, who heard it from Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver who supposedly heard it in Egypt from priests at Sais. Already we're at third-hand memory about events said to be thousands of years old. The priests, according to Plato, chide Solon. "You Greeks are always children," they tell him. "No old man exists among you." Why? Because civilization keeps getting wiped out. Fire, water, disruptions in the motion of the heavens. Resets. Each time Egypt survives a little better because the Nile buffers them from catastrophe. But elsewhere, cultures are erased so thoroughly they forget their own past. Then they give Solon an example. 9,000 years before his visit, they say, there was a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, Atlantis. It wasn't just a city, it was an empire, controlling islands and parts of the opposite continent, threatening even the Mediterranean. Its kings came from a union of a god, Poseidon, and a mortal woman. Its capital was laid out in perfect concentric rings of land and water, connected by canals, gleaming with orichalcum, a mysterious metal second only to gold. In Critias, Plato goes into loving detail, carefully measured walls, harbours, temples, racetracks, laws engraved on columns, a standing army with exact troop numbers. We're told about irrigation systems, a planned city, a complex state religion. This is not a vague, misty golden age. It's an advanced, engineered society. And then, the fall at some point. Plato says the Atlanteans grew vain, their divine nature diluted by human weakness. They turned greedy, unjust, warlike. They launched an assault on the Mediterranean, trying to subjugate everyone. The virtuous Athenians of that era, another lost civilization, according to the story, stood against them and won. Right after this moral victory, nature intervened. In a single day and night of unusual earthquakes and floods, the entire Atlantean power centre sank into the sea. The sea above it became muddy and shallow, dangerous to navigate. Civilization reset. So what is Plato doing here? Most classicists read Atlantis as an allegory. Plato is using an invented empire as a mirror to talk about hubris, ideal states, and the moral decay of power. The detailed measurements in that view are like the specks on an imaginary utopia, philosophy, not reportage. Others have wondered if something else is going on. Maybe Atlantis is an exaggerated memory of a real place, or of multiple places fused together in story. A maritime culture in the Atlantic, a Bronze Age power that vanished, a coastal civilization wiped by flood or earthquake, remembered dimly and reshaped into a morality play. That ambiguity is exactly why the story has refused to die. Over the last 2 centuries, people have tried to pin Atlantis to almost every corner of the map. Some place it on the island of Santorini, linking it to the Minoan eruption that devastated the Aegean. Others look to the Azores, buried undersea plateaus in the Atlantic, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. There are proposals in Spain's Doñana marshes, on the coast of Morocco in the Black Sea, on submerged continental shelves now hundreds of meters underwater. Most of these theories stretch the evidence. Mainstream archaeology hasn't found a smoking gun Atlantis. But step back from the specifics, which island, which bay, which shoal, something more interesting appears. Plato's Atlantis hits the same beats we've been tracing, but with a new twist. A highly ordered, technically capable society, monumental architecture, planned canals, agriculture, perhaps even something like early global trade, a sudden moral slide into arrogance and conquest. Then, without much warning, a cataclysm that doesn't just damage them, it erases their centre of power in one stroke. What's left is scattered survivors, muddy seas, broken memory. Sound familiar? You can read Atlantis as one city that fell, or on another level as a placeholder, a symbolic stand-in for whatever high phase might have existed before the last big reset. Not necessarily with ray guns and anti-gravity, but with social complexity, engineering knowledge, mapped coasts, maybe even a deeper understanding of the sky than we expect for prehistoric people. If cultures around the world preserved flood stories as memory myths of drowning landscapes, then Plato's Egyptian priests are saying something similar about civilization itself. It rises, it shines, it rots, it drowns, and the survivors don't remember clearly what they've lost. That's the version of Atlantis that matters for our question. Not whether there was literally a ringed island city outside Gibraltar with orichalcum walls, but whether Plato accidentally preserved an echo already filtered through Egypt, through Solon, through family storytelling, of a real, older layer of human organization that ended in water and fire. Because if even part of that is true, then Atlantis stops being an outlier fantasy and starts looking like one local chapter in a much wider pattern. And the next piece of that pattern is not a dialogue or a parable, but a hypothesis backed by crater fields, meltwater pulses and black layers in the soil. To see whether the planet itself bears the scars of a recent reset, we have to jump forward from Plato's imagined past to the end of the last ice age, and to something called the Younger Dryas. The planet was supposed to be thawing out. About 14,700 years ago, the great ice sheets that had covered much of North America and northern Europe for tens of thousands of years were finally in retreat. Temperatures climbed, glaciers shrank, huge meltwater rivers thundered off the ice into the oceans. In climate terms, we were coming out of a deep freeze and heading into something roughly like the modern world. Then, around 12,900 years ago, the graph goes off a cliff. In ice cores from Greenland, you can see it as a razor-sharp line. Temperatures plunge back toward Ice Age conditions in what seems, on geological timescales, almost overnight. Europe and North America snap from warming to sudden deep cold. This cold spell lasts about 1,200 years. We call it the Younger Dryas. To put that in human terms, imagine your ancestors finally seeing milder winters, more plants, more animals, game herds rebounding, glaciers pulling back from valleys that had been locked in ice for generations. Then, within a handful of years, maybe within a single human lifetime, the world flips. The cold returns, ecosystems crash, rainfall patterns change. The promised spring of the Holocene is yanked away. Mainstream climate science explains this as a kind of internal hiccup in the Earth system. The standard story goes like this. As the ice sheets melted, gigantic lakes of fresh water pooled along their edges. One of those lakes, often identified with glacial Lake Agassiz in North America, catastrophically drained into the North Atlantic. That sudden pulse of cold, fresh water shut down or weakened the ocean currents that carry heat northward. Europe and parts of North America froze. That's one model. But there's another idea on the table, one that sounds uncomfortably like the fire and flood catastrophes preserved in myth. It's called the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. In this scenario, the abrupt climate reversal wasn't just a quirk of ocean circulation. Something hit us. Not necessarily a giant, dinosaur-killer asteroid, but a fragmented comet, or a swarm of objects breaking up in the atmosphere and exploding as air bursts over the northern ice sheets. Supporters of the hypothesis point to a strange, thin layer in the soil, a black mat that appears at sites across North America, parts of Europe and the Middle East, all dated right around that 12,900-year mark. In that layer, researchers have reported some unusual things. They find spikes in platinum, a metal more common in meteorites than in Earth's crust. They find microscopic diamonds, nanodiamonds, that can be produced in the high-pressure shock of an impact or an airburst. They report melted spherules and glassy particles that look like they were formed at extremely high temperatures. In some locations, there are signs of continent-scale wildfires, massive burn layers that suggest something set forests and grasslands ablaze on an enormous scale. Right on top of that layer, a pattern appears in the bones. This is the time window when many of the large land animals of the Americas vanish. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American camels and horses. In the standard story, these megafauna disappear because of a combination of rapid climate change and overhunting by newly arrived humans, the so-called overkill hypothesis. The impact camp says, maybe there was a third player, a cosmic hammer that shattered ecosystems already under stress. Sudden cold, sudden fires, poisoned air and water, shockwaves, and superheated winds racing across the ice. A literal reset button pressed from space. Now, layer this over what we've been talking about. A sudden freezing of the world just as it was warming. Floods of meltwater, and then, possibly, a new surge of melt as ice destabilized. Wildfires, darkened skies, a sharp break between one ecological regime and another. In human memory, how would that feel? Like the end of an age. We've already seen that many traditions speak of a time when the previous world was destroyed by water, fire, or both. A golden, or at least more benign, era cut off by catastrophe. If an event like the Younger Dryas onset slammed into early human societies, hunter-gatherers with growing knowledge of landscapes, coasts, maybe even early experiments with cultivation, their stories would not remember North Atlantic thermohaline circulation. They would remember burning horizons, failed seasons, drowned lowlands, vanishing herds. They would remember that the sky did it. But we have to be careful here. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis is controversial. Many geologists and archaeologists are unconvinced. Some studies have failed to replicate the nanodiamond and spherule findings. Others argue that platinum spikes can come from volcanic sources, or that the black mat is just an organic layer from wetter conditions, not a global fallout blanket. Climate modelers can produce a Younger Dryas-style cooling without invoking anything from space, just using fresh water and ocean currents. On the other hand, new papers keep appearing that support at least parts of the impact picture, finding more platinum anomalies, more possible impact proxies at more sites. The debate is active, sometimes heated, no consensus yet. It may turn out that there was no impact, or that there was one, but it wasn't the main driver of the climate flip. Or that multiple things happened at once, meltwater pulses, shifting currents, and a nasty surprise from the sky. For our purposes, the key point is not to declare a winner in that scientific argument. It's to notice that either way, something very real happened around 12,900 years ago. The climate system jolted, environments transformed. Animal populations collapsed. Human groups living through that transition had to adapt fast, move, reorganize, or die. If there were any pockets of unusually complex culture, any coastal or riverine communities experimenting with settled life, early architecture, or proto-cities right at the end of the Ice Age, this is exactly the kind of event that could have smashed them, wiped their physical traces, and left only memory shadows in myth. In other words, the Younger Dryas isn't just an obscure blip in a climate graph. It's a candidate for a real global-scale reset, sitting right at the edge of history, on the threshold where archaeology begins to glimpse monumental building. And as we move to Göbekli Tepe, a site that appears almost immediately after this turmoil, already strange, already sophisticated, the question becomes unavoidable. Did someone carry knowledge through that reset? When archaeologists first dug into the dusty hill called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, they thought they were dealing with some kind of medieval ruin, maybe a Byzantine outpost, maybe an old cemetery. Then the radiocarbon dates came back. 11,600 years, not 2,000 years old. Not 5,000 years old, older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids by around 7,000. Older than writing, older than pottery in most places, older than what we've been taught to call civilization itself, and not a campsite or a scatter of crude huts, but a megalithic ritual complex. At Göbekli Tepe we find stone circles up to 20 meters across, built from towering T-shaped pillars, some weighing 10 to 20 tons. 2 massive central pillars stand in each circle like presiding figures. The stones are not rough boulders, they are carefully quarried, shaped and set into carved sockets in the bedrock. This is supposed to be the world of simple hunter-gatherers, no cities, no agriculture, no metal, just small bands of foragers wandering the landscape. So who, exactly, was moving 20-ton stones, organising labour, planning circular enclosures, and carving intricate bas-reliefs into limestone 11,600 years ago? Because the carvings are the next shock. The pillars are covered with animals and symbols. Foxes, snakes, wild boar, vultures, scorpions, big cats, cranes. Some are so finely rendered you can feel the muscles under their skin. Others are abstract, H shapes, strange repeated symbols, rows of what look like handheld tools or maybe stylized people. Many researchers think the T-pillars themselves are anthropomorphic, stylized human beings. Some show carved arms along the sides, hands clasped around a belt, with a loincloth indicated below. In other words, these aren't just random rocks. They're deliberate, symbolic constructions made by people who were thinking in myths, in categories, in stories, and the date, around 9,600 BC, is not random either. It lands almost exactly at the end of the Younger Dryas, the moment when that sudden cold snap breaks and the climate stabilizes into the relatively gentle Holocene, right after a possible global reset on a hill in Anatolia. A group of people raises a stone temple that looks like it belongs to a much later age. Mainstream archaeology explains it as a kind of cathedral on the hill of the last hunter-gatherers, a centre where scattered bands came together seasonally to feast, dance, perform rituals and cement alliances. Some scholars argue that the effort needed to build and maintain Göbekli Tepe may actually have pushed people toward agriculture. You need stable food surpluses to feed teams of stoneworkers and quarrymen. On that view, temples didn't come after farming. Temples helped cause farming. But even in the conservative reading, Göbekli Tepe forces a rewrite. Monumental architecture, complex ritual and long-distance cooperation appear before settled villages and full-scale agriculture, not after. Symbolic culture is not the icing on the cake of civilization. It's there at the very foundation. Then there's the part that might connect it to a deeper, older story. Göbekli Tepe was not destroyed by invaders. It was not swallowed by the sea. It was buried, deliberately. Layer after layer of rubble, broken stone and refuse were packed in around the pillars, filling the enclosures until only a low mound remained. This wasn't a slow drifting of soil over abandoned ruins. It was intentional backfilling on a massive scale. Someone decided these circles needed to disappear. Why? No one knows. Some think it was a ritual closure, a way of decommissioning a sacred space when its time was over. Others suggest social change, new beliefs, new centers of power, old cults sealed away like dangerous relics. A few researchers, and many independent thinkers, have floated a darker possibility that people were hiding something, that the knowledge encoded in the site, its symbols, its alignments, was meant to be preserved underground, protected from time, erosion, maybe even from another catastrophe. That last idea is speculation, but it hangs there, especially when you look at the sky. Several studies have suggested that the layout and imagery at Göbekli Tepe may have astronomical connections. Some alignments appear to point towards significant positions of stars or constellations, as they would have appeared around 10,000 BC. One controversial proposal is that a particular pillar, crowded with animals, including a vulture, a scorpion, and a bending quadruped, encodes a date using constellations, perhaps commemorating a dramatic event in the sky. Most astronomers and archaeologists are cautious about this. Correlating ancient carvings with constellations is tricky. It's easy to see patterns that aren't really there. But we know that many later cultures around the world tracked precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. We know they encoded sky cycles into myth and monument. If Göbekli Tepe is even a proto-version of that, a first attempt to fix the heavens in stone, then we're looking at organised astronomical observation right after a planetary upheaval. That raises an uncomfortable question. If this is the beginning, why does it already look like the middle of a story? We have sophisticated stoneworking, monumental architecture, complex ritual, possible sky law, and some kind of regional organisation, all appearing almost as soon as the Ice Age crisis ends. No long, archaeologically visible ramp-up. No thousands of years of clumsy experiments with tiny shrines and half-hearted stone rings. Just here it is. One way to read that is to assume we're missing something. Maybe earlier, more modest sites are still under alluvium or the sea. Maybe we just haven't looked in the right places yet. That's entirely possible. Another way, which many researchers would call bold and many others would call reckless, is to treat Göbekli Tepe as a survivor's monument. Not the first flicker of organised knowledge, but the first time that knowledge managed to break the surface again, after a long period of chaos. The work of hunter-gatherers, yes, but hunter-gatherers carrying memories, stories, perhaps even fragments of techniques handed down from people who lived along the coasts and river valleys of a world that melted, flooded, and froze. We can't prove that. We may never be able to. What Göbekli Tepe does prove, beyond debate, is that at the very dawn of the Holocene, humans were already gathering in large numbers, coordinating complex projects, and investing staggering effort into places that seemed to encode meaning, not mere survival. Something had made the stars, the animals, and the invisible world important enough to carve into stone on a scale that would echo across 12,000 years. If there was a reset, Göbekli Tepe stands right on the other side of it, like a stone bookmark in the human record, saying some part of the story made it through. And when we look closer at that story, the sky keeps showing up. Not just here, but again and again, in cultures that never met. Which is why the next piece of this puzzle is not a temple or a myth, but a very slow motion wobble in the earth itself, and the way ancient people seem to have noticed it long before we did. If you go outside tonight just before dawn and mark where a bright star rises on the horizon, then do the same thing tomorrow, and the next day, and the next month, you'll see what every ancient sky watcher saw. The sky is regular, predictable, the stars rise in the same places, trace the same paths. The constellations march around you like gears in a clock. But there's a hidden glitch in that clock. It's so slow that no single person can see it. It takes centuries to become obvious, millennia to complete a cycle, and yet somehow again and again, across continents and ages, humans noticed it, and then buried it inside their myths, temples, and sacred numbers. That glitch is called the Precession of the Equinoxes. Earth doesn't spin like a perfect, stable top. Our planet is tilted about 23.5 degrees, and that tilt slowly wobbles like a spinning top that's very, very gradually beginning to lean a different way. The axis of Earth traces out a circle in the sky. One full wobble takes about 25,920 years. Because of that wobble, the point where the sun crosses the celestial equator in spring, the spring equinox, doesn't stay put among the stars. It drifts slowly backwards through the zodiac, about 1 degree every 72 years, roughly one zodiac sign every 2,160 years, all the way around the circle in that 25,000 plus year cycle. To see this, you have to do something almost impossible for individuals, but straightforward for cultures. You have to keep records for a very long time. You have to know when my great-great-great-grandparents said the sun rose in Taurus at the spring equinox, and I now see it rising in Aries. Something has changed. Not just the seasons, not just a flood or a drought, the frame of the sky itself. Mainstream historians will say that precession was first explicitly discovered by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC by comparing his measurements with older Babylonian star catalogues. That's solid text-based history. But then things get stranger. Because the further you look back, the more you find hints that cultures long before Hipparchus may have been tracking this same slow wobble and wrapping it in story. The ancient Indian tradition speaks of vast cycles of time, yugas, whose total lengths sometimes add up to numbers suspiciously close to precessional periods. In some reckonings, the great year of nearly 24,000 years appears, echoing that axial wobble. In Egypt, the priesthood anchored their calendar to the heliacal rising of Sirius and the flooding of the Nile, but their myths talk about ages ruled by different gods, different companies of deities, and a first time that feels like a reset point. Some researchers note that key temple axes, like those at Dendera and Karnak, seem to track not just the daily and yearly motion of the sun, but the slow shifting of stellar targets over long spans, as if the buildings themselves were part of a multi-generational measuring device. In the West, we inherited the language of astrological ages, the age of Taurus, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, the coming age of Aquarius, each roughly 2,000-odd years long, each supposedly marked by social upheaval, religious change, or world renewal. In the ancient Near East, bull cults dominate. Then, in the age of Aries, ram symbolism and warrior gods rise. In the current age of Pisces, fish symbolism and water imagery saturate a major world religion. Is that neat alignment just pattern-seeking after the fact? Maybe, but the underlying astronomical reality is uncontroversial. The equinox does move through the constellations on that timetable. Somebody, somewhere, needed centuries of careful skywatching to even propose that at places like Nabta Playa in the Egyptian desert, stone circles from around 7,000 years ago appear to align with the solstices and with specific star risings. At Angkor in Cambodia, the main axis ties into solstitial sun positions and the precessional shift of certain star groups. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and their predecessors built observatories like El Caracol that track Venus and the Sun, but their long count calendar also gestures toward enormous cycles of time, world ages that begin and end. None of this is a smoking gun. Alignments can be coincidental, constellations are culturally flexible, and once you know precession exists, you can retroactively weave it into everything. Most professional archaeologists are cautious for exactly that reason. But there's a pattern in the patterns. Cultures that had no metal telescopes, no written calculus, no satellite data, are nevertheless obsessed with three things: fixed stars, turning points of the sun, and very long cycles that outlive any one dynasty. They build stone machines that lock on to particular points on the horizon. They preserve star lore in oral traditions. They divide time into worlds, suns, ages, each with its own character, each ending in fire or flood or darkness. And the lengths of those ages? They often come in multiples of 72, 216, 2160, 25,920. The same numbers you get when you start slicing up a precessional great year. Independent researchers like Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deckend argued that myths around the world, from Greece to India to the Norse sagas, are secretly talking about precession, using gods, beasts and hero cycles as memory devices for a celestial mechanism. More recent popularizers like Graham Hancock and others go further. They suggest that the global awareness of precessional cycles might be a fingerprint of an older, forgotten astronomical tradition, a seafaring or coastal culture wiped out by one or more cataclysms, but remembered in fragmented form by the survivors. On that view, places like Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, Giza, Angkor, even some megalithic sites in Europe, are not random outbursts of local genius. They're different dialects of the same ancestral language, stone, star, and cycle. Again, this is a hypothesis, not a proven fact. You won't find a 20,000-year-old observatory manual hiding in a cave to clinch it, but think about what it would take, with no modern instruments, to notice precession from scratch. You need multiple generations of careful observers, all trained to the same standards. You need records that survive fires, wars, migrations, regime changes. You need institutions, priesthoods, lineages of skywatchers that treat continuity as sacred. And you need a reason to care about a cycle so slow that it has no effect on planting next year's crops or timing next month's hunt. Unless you're not just farming for next year, you're planning for resets. If your myths tell you the world has ended before and will end again, you might start looking for the biggest, slowest gears in the cosmic clock. You might decide that when the sun rises against a new backdrop of stars on the spring equinox, it's not just an astronomical curiosity. It's a changing of the cosmic administration, a transfer of power from one age to another. Even if later people forget the underlying math, they might keep the shell of the story. The 4 or 5 or 7 worlds, the sequence of beasts or symbols ruling epochs, the sacred numbers that encode cycles in plain sight. In that sense, precession becomes more than a wobble. It becomes a storage device, a way for cultures, and perhaps for civilizations separated by disaster, to pass forward a message. Time is not just a line. It's a wheel. The sky moves in great circles. What has been, will be again. On the face of it, that's just cosmology. But if civilizations really do rise and fall in rhythm with environmental shocks and orbital quirks, then buried inside all this sky lore might be something else as well. An ancient warning label written in the position of the stars. If precession is the slow ticking of the cosmic clock, sacred geometry is the script written on its face. When you start looking for it, the same handful of shapes and proportions keep showing up in places that, as far as we know, never shared a text, a priesthood, or an empire. The golden ratio, the flower of life, the vesica piscis. The golden ratio, usually written as phi, about 1.618, is what you get when you divide a line so that the whole is to the larger part as the larger part is to the smaller. It's a simple idea, but it produces spirals that look eerily like nautilus shells, hurricanes, and spiral galaxies. It shows up in pentagons, in some plant growth patterns, in the way branches split and veins fork. The vesica piscis is even simpler. 2 circles of the same size, their centres each lying on the circumference of the other. The overlapping almond shape in the middle, that's the vesica. From just those 2 circles you can derive a surprising amount of geometry, equilateral triangles, basic ratios, even approximations of square roots. Arrange circles like that over and over, centre to circumference, and you get the flower of life, a lattice of interlocking circles that has become almost a logo for sacred geometry today. Now, here's the part that bothers people who think culture evolves in isolated straight lines. You find the flower of life pattern burned into granite in the Osirian at Abydos in Egypt. You find nearly identical circle lattices carved into ancient Indian temples. Similar designs appear in medieval European churches, Islamic art, Chinese bronzes, even on the floors of synagogues. The vesica piscis turns up in Christian iconography as the halo shape around Christ or the Virgin, in mandalas carved over temple doors, in Gothic arches. The golden ratio is claimed in the Parthenon, in the Great Pyramid, in Renaissance paintings, in the layout of medieval cathedrals. Sometimes the claims are overstated or retrofitted. Archaeologists and mathematicians will point out that not every rectangle that looks nice is exactly golden. Not every spiral in nature is a perfect phi spiral. Humans are talented at seeing patterns, even where none were intended. But even if we strip away the exaggerations, something remains. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, Mesoamerica, and Europe, you see temples and monuments laid out according to clear geometric rules. Squares subdivided into smaller squares, circles inscribed with hexagons, ratios that hover near key constants, pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, and phi, the golden ratio embedded in diagonal lengths and height to base relations. In the Great Pyramid, for example, if you take the height and the perimeter of the base, you can derive an approximation of pi. Some researchers argue that phi appears in the slope angle. Mainstream archaeology tends to be cautious. Maybe these are side effects of using simple whole number ratios and practical surveying methods. Others see intentional encoding, a kind of stone textbook in arithmetic and geometry. The same argument plays out at sites like Teotihuacan in Mexico, where the distances between pyramids track simple multiples of a base unit, and at Angkor, where temple dimensions seem to echo calendrical and astronomical numbers. Are these just convenient building choices, or is there a philosophy behind them? One hypothesis, often floated in esoteric traditions, is that geometry became a universal language that could survive resets. Unlike a specific myth about a local god, a right angle is a right angle anywhere on Earth. A triangle with sides 3, 4, 5 will always contain a right angle, whether you're in Old Kingdom Egypt or classical China. The square root of 2, the ratio embedded in a simple diagonal, doesn't care about your dynasty. So if you suspected that floods, fires, or long dark ages might erase your words, you might try to tuck your knowledge into things that don't burn as easily. Ratios, proportions, temple plans, symbolic diagrams. That's exactly how later secret societies talk about it. Medieval and Renaissance stonemasons preserved tracing boards and design rules that were half engineering, half metaphysics. Kabbalists mapped the divine onto geometric trees. Islamic scholars explored complex tilings and star patterns that, centuries later, physicists would recognize as close cousins to quasi-crystals and symmetry groups. Modern science has its own, very different, rediscovery of sacred geometry. Fractals, shapes that repeat their structure at different scales, are found in coastlines, lungs, river networks, and plants. Fibonacci sequences and near-phi ratios show up in phyllotaxis, the way leaves and seeds arrange themselves for optimal packing and light exposure. The equations of wave interference produce the same overlapping circle lattices you see in the flower of life. In physics, symmetries described by abstract groups determine the allowed forms of fundamental particles. None of that proves that an advanced lost civilization sat down and chose these shapes as a message for the future. It may simply be that when any intelligent species starts paying serious attention to reality, certain patterns are inescapable. Circles, because planets and eyes and ripples are round. Triangles, because 3 points define a plane. Hexagons, because that's how you pack things efficiently, from honeycombs to basalt columns. But that's precisely what makes geometry such a good candidate for a cross-reset language. You can lose libraries, you can forget scripts, you can watch your pantheon dissolve under conquest and plague. Yet if, thousands of years later, another culture stands on the same ground and tries to build carefully, measure carefully, watch the sky carefully, they will encounter the same constants. Pi, phi, square roots, simple harmonic ratios. They might see an old temple or a half-buried stone circle and recognize not the myths but the math, the way the structure breathes with integers and proportions. They might feel that someone long ago was speaking in a tongue they now almost understand. And around the world, the evidence suggests that many peoples, separated by oceans and ages, decided to say the same thing the same way, with circles and lines, with ratios and spirals, with a geometry that looks a lot like the skeleton of nature itself. If sacred geometry is the language, these places are the shouted sentences carved into the planet. Let's start with Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon. On a hill that's been sacred since deep prehistory, the Romans built an enormous temple complex to Jupiter. That part is not mysterious. What bothers people is what those Roman builders chose to build on top of. Underneath the classical columns and courtyards, there's a megalithic platform, foundation stones so big that the usual story of a lot of slaves and some ropes starts to feel thin. 3 of those blocks, the famous trilithon, each weigh in the neighbourhood of 800 tons. Not total, each. Nearby in the quarry sits an unfinished stone, sometimes called the stone of the pregnant woman, and another still partially buried under it. Estimates run from 1,000 to over 1,600 tons apiece. To put that in perspective, a modern heavy truck is maybe 40 tons fully loaded. We're talking about moving the equivalent of 20 to 40 trucks as a single piece of stone, then fitting it into place so precisely that you can't slide a sheet of paper between the joins. Mainstream archaeology says, yes, it's extreme, but not impossible. With a huge coordinated workforce, wooden rollers, sledges, lubricated tracks, earth ramps, and a lot of time, you can in theory move absurdly heavy objects. The Romans were engineering monsters. They built aqueducts, domes, and harbours that still astonish us. Others point out that there's no clear, experimentally demonstrated method for dragging a 1,000-ton block up a slope and lifting it into a multi-layered wall with the tools we know they had. They suggest that maybe the most massive stones predate the Roman phase, that what we think of as a Roman temple might actually be a renovation of something much older, inherited from an earlier culture with an unknown building tradition. Either way, Baalbek stands there as a physical fact. Whatever the exact date and method, somebody knew how to plan, quarry, transport and seat those stones, and that know-how is gone. Half a world away, high on the altiplano of Bolivia, Puma Punku raises the same question in a very different style. The stones here are smaller than Baalbek's giants, but their precision is almost unsettling. Massive andesite blocks sliced into crisp right angles and complex interlocking shapes. H blocks with slots, channels and internal corners that look like they were machine milled. Surfaces that, in places, are so flat they've been compared to machined metal. Potato farmers on the nearby hills still walk on the same air, 12,000 feet above sea level, where oxygen is thin and winters bite hard. According to mainstream chronology, the Tiwanaku culture built Puma Punku around 500–600 CE using stone hammers abrasive sand, and clever jigs. Experimental archaeology has shown that with enough time, you can get surprisingly clean cuts with Bronze Age tools and patience. But the unresolved engineering questions remain. How did they standardize so many complex blocks with such tight tolerances at that altitude without metal saws or lathes? Why design modular, interlocking pieces if you're only building a single ceremonial platform? It feels like the work of a mind thinking in three-dimensional blueprints in a system, not just in piles of rocks. Then there's the Giza Plateau. By now, everyone has heard arguments about how the Great Pyramid was built. Ramps, spirals, internal galleries, tens of thousands of workers over decades. Most Egyptologists are confident that with copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden sledges, and massive labour organisation, Old Kingdom Egypt could do what we see. But even within that consensus, there are puzzles. The base of the Great Pyramid is oriented to true north within a tiny fraction of a degree. Its sides are remarkably straight over hundreds of metres. The difference in length between the longest and shortest side is less than the width of your hand. Internally, the so-called King's Chamber is built from 50 to 80-ton granite blocks hauled from hundreds of kilometres away, stacked and locked above the central void in a relieving system that still works 4,500 years later. Add to that the numerical curiosities, perimeter to height ratios that approximate pi, possible encodings of astronomical cycles in shaft alignments and layout. Some researchers insist those are design goals. Others argue they're emergent properties of practical surveying and whole number geometry. Like Baalbek and Puma Punku, Giza sits at the edge of what we're comfortable crediting to the tools we've assigned to its builders. That's where the two narratives diverge. On one side you have the mainstream view. These are the masterpieces of cultures we actually know, pushed to their limits by generations of trial and error and social organization. No lost super-civilization needed. On the other side, you have alternative theories that these sites are palimpsests with younger civilizations building on far older foundations. That key elements might come from an earlier cycle of humanity, one that had mastered stonework and surveying techniques we don't fully understand, and that later peoples inherited, reused, or half-remembered. In this framework, Baalbek's foundations, Puma Punku's interlocking blocks, and the Great Pyramid's alignments aren't just big rocks. They're survivors, fragments of an engineering language that may have passed through multiple resets, partially preserved in myth and ritual, but most stubbornly in stone. We don't have to claim certainty to see what they represent in this story. Evidence that human beings, at some point before written history solidified, learned how to do things that we still argue about today. And if that kind of knowledge can survive in granite and limestone across millennia of flood, fire and empire, what else might have survived? Not in stone, but in symbols. One of those symbols keeps showing up like a bad penny, or maybe like a breadcrumb, the serpent, the dragon. You can erase cities, grind languages into dust, wipe bloodlines off the map. But somehow, when the stories grow back, the snake is still there. In Mesopotamia, at the dawn of written myth, you get Tiamat, the primordial sea dragon. She's not just a monster, she's the raw chaos from which everything comes. The younger gods kill her, slice her in half, and use her body to build the heavens and the earth. Creation literally carved out of a slain serpent. Move a little later and you meet Ningishzida, a Sumerian god whose symbol is two snakes winding around a staff. Lord of the Tree of Truth, guardian of the underworld. That double serpent motif should feel familiar to you. It never really went away. In Egypt, the pattern repeats with different names. You have Apophis, the great chaos serpent, attacking Ra's solar boat every night in the underworld. trying to drag the cosmos back into nothingness. Creation as a daily battle against the snake. But Egypt also gives you Wadjet, the cobra rearing from the pharaoh's brow. The uraeus, same animal, opposite role, protective fire spitter, emblem of royal power and divine sight. To wear the serpent is to see danger before it comes, to hold a kind of awakened lethal wisdom. China turns the serpent into a nation-shaping identity. Chinese dragons aren't just big lizards with bad attitudes. They control rain and rivers, the lifeblood of agriculture. The dragon dances between heaven and earth as a mediator of cosmic chi. Emperors call themselves sons of the dragon. One of the oldest Chinese creation stories has the dragon-bodied goddess Nuwa moulding humans from clay and repairing a broken sky. Same archetype. Serpentine being, water, sky, creation, restoration. Cross the Pacific and you meet Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica. In Aztec and older Toltec and Olmec traditions, Quetzalcoatl teaches humans agriculture, crafts, even the calendar. He brings maize. He organizes time. He's associated with Venus, a planet that appears as both morning star and evening star, disappearing and reappearing in a regular cycle. A serpent with feathers is a creature of two worlds, ground and air. Instinct and intellect. Again, a liminal being who bridges realms and brings first knowledge. You could do this all day. The rainbow serpent of Australian Aboriginal traditions, tied to waterholes, creation, and law. The Nagas of Hindu and Buddhist law serpent beings who guard treasure and sometimes teach the Buddha himself. The biblical serpent in Eden, tempting humans with forbidden knowledge that opens their eyes and destroys their old world in one move. Over and over, the snake or dragon sits right at the hinge point between destruction and awakening. Poison and medicine in the same fangs. So why is this thing everywhere? There are basic evolutionary answers. Humans and snakes have shared landscapes for tens of millions of years. Our vision is tuned to notice that sinuous movement. A coiled snake triggers deep fear, and if you survive, deep learning. The snake becomes the perfect symbol for danger that forces adaptation. But that doesn't explain the whole pattern. In most of these myths, the serpent isn't just scary. It's tied to beginnings, to the moment when before ends and after begins. In creation stories, a dragon is killed, and the world is made from its body. Or a serpent curls around the world tree, linking heaven, earth, and underworld. Or a snake whispers a secret that breaks the old order and launches a new one. The first knowledge is serpent knowledge. Sometimes it's what you're not supposed to know. Sometimes it's what you must know to survive. That's where modern interpretations get interesting. In Indian yogic traditions, Kundalini is the coiled serpent energy sleeping at the base of the spine. Awakening it, raising it through the chakras, is supposed to transform consciousness, burn away old patterns, and open higher perception. Again, serpent as latent power, dangerous if mishandled, liberating if mastered. Fast forward to modern biology, and that double serpent from ancient Mesopotamia suddenly looks like a double helix. Two strands winding around an invisible axis, information coded in a spiral. The caduceus and rod of Asclepius, those old snake and staff symbols of healing, get retroactively read as proto-DNA diagrams. Most historians would call that projection. There's no hard evidence. Sumerian priests were modelling chromosomes. But in this story we're following, it's the rhyme that matters. Ancient serpent equals life force, healing, forbidden knowledge, the thin line between life and death. Modern snake equals emblem for medicine, and a shape that just happens to mirror the structure carrying your entire genetic memory. If civilizations rise and fall in cycles, if there really have been cultural resets, what kind of symbol would you choose to try to talk to the future? You'd want something tied to visceral fear, so people pay attention. You'd want it simple enough to carve into stone, flexible enough to attach to new myths, and deep enough to encode multiple layers of meaning: danger, cycle, rebirth, knowledge, life itself. A serpent shedding its skin is a built-in metaphor for renewal. A dragon coiled around the world is a shorthand for cosmic cycles. A snake offering fruit or wisdom at the turning point of a story is a marker. This is the place where everything changes. Maybe that's all it is, the ultimate human shorthand for transformation under threat. Or maybe, as some esoteric traditions quietly suggest, the serpent is a kind of survival marker. A symbol deliberately carried across floods and fires, tucked into different mythologies, pointing back to a memory of previous endings, and a reminder of what you need to remember when the next reset comes. Because if stone can carry geometry through a cataclysm, symbols can carry instructions. And the serpent is the one symbol that never seems to die. If symbols can be breadcrumbs, somebody has to bake the bread. Somebody has to decide what gets wrapped in myth, what gets sworn to secrecy, what gets handed only to the few, and why. That's where the idea of mystery schools and secret fraternities walks into the story. Not as hooded figures twirling mustaches in the dark, but as a proposed answer to a brutal question: how do you keep anything alive when history keeps getting erased? Go back to Egypt again, but now not to pyramids and serpent crowns. Go to the temples. We know that Egyptian priesthoods weren't just doing public rituals. There was an inner curriculum, initiation, graded access. Inner chambers where only the specially trained could go. The ancient Greek writers who visited Egypt, Herodotus, Plato, later Plutarch, hint that the priests guarded a body of astronomical, mathematical, and cosmological knowledge that wasn't for the general population. Were they preserving pre-cataclysm wisdom? That's the claim some later traditions make. Hermetic texts from the Hellenistic period talk about a primordial wisdom given by Thoth or Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great, supposedly reaching back to a time before the Nile civilization we can date. The mainstream view is that these are late philosophical works dressed up in antique clothing. But even if they're not literally prehistoric, the structure is revealing a lineage of guardians, passing down knowledge in a chain of teachers and initiates through rise and fall. The Greeks copy the pattern. The Eleusinian mysteries, tied to Demeter and Persephone, ran for almost 2,000 years. People from all over the Mediterranean came to be initiated. We still don't know exactly what happened there. Silence was part of the deal. But we know initiates came away convinced they understood something about life, death and rebirth that ordinary people didn't. Same with the Orphic cults with Pythagoras and his followers. Pythagoras isn't just triangle guy from high school. Ancient sources describe a quasi-monastic community with rules of secrecy, stages of initiation, a graded revelation of doctrine. They weren't just doing arithmetic. Number itself was sacred. Ratios, harmonies, geometric forms were seen as keys to the structure of reality. And here's where the old motifs start to echo. In Egyptian temple schools, proportion and sacred geometry structure everything from columns to star ceilings. In Greek mystery traditions, number and harmony unlock the music of the spheres. In later esoteric systems, those same ratios resurface as divine architecture, angelic hierarchies, even the scaffolding of Kabbalistic trees. Across different languages and myths, the skeleton of the teaching looks strangely continuous. The world as ordered, patterned, knowable through a mix of symbol, number, and ritual experience. Fast forward a couple thousand years, and you meet new groups claiming to be heirs of those ancient schools. Freemasonry, for example, appears in its recognizable form in the 17th and 18th centuries. Historically, it grows out of medieval stonemason guilds and Enlightenment clubs. But its own myths trace back to Solomon's Temple, to Egyptian builders, sometimes all the way to antediluvian patriarchs before the flood. Masonic rituals reenact the building, loss, and symbolic rebuilding of a temple. The tools are simple, square, compass, level, but they're loaded with layered meanings about moral alignment, cosmic order, and the human role in construction, both literal and metaphysical. Geometry is not just math, it is God's language. The lodge becomes a microcosm of the universe. That structure, an inner circle, graded degrees, symbolic enactments meant to transmit ideas deeper than the surface story, is almost exactly what ancient accounts describe in the mystery schools. Rosicrucian manifestos show up slightly earlier, in the 1600s, claiming an invisible fraternity founded by a mysterious Christian Rosencreutz who had travelled through the East, learning secret wisdom in Arabia, Egypt, and beyond. The texts claim this brotherhood has existed quietly for generations, preserving and gently steering knowledge, waiting for the right time to launch a reformation of science, religion, and politics. Historically, those documents probably came out of specific German intellectual circles. But the story they tell is again about continuity through rupture, a small group carrying an older pattern of insight through war, plague, religious conflict, and cultural volatility. You see similar narratives in other esoteric currents. Alchemy presents itself as a chain of adepts from Egypt and Babylon, through Alexandria, the Islamic Golden Age, and medieval Europe. Kabbalists speak of a hidden tradition transmitted from before the flood, encoded in letters and numbers. Sufi orders talk about an inner stream of knowledge, the batin, flowing underneath outer forms and surviving regime changes and conquests. In each case, the claim is the same shape. Even if the content differs, there is a deeper layer of understanding about the cosmos and the human role in it. It has been endangered many times. It has survived by going underground into symbols, allegories, and tight-knit brotherhoods. From a skeptical historical perspective, almost all of these ancient lineages fray quickly when you chase the paperwork. Freemasonry, as we know it, doesn't show up before early modern Europe. Rosicrucianism seems to be born in the 17th century, not in some forgotten Egyptian monastery. The Hermetic texts are late antique, not Atlantean. Kabbalah, in its classic form, crystallizes in medieval Provence and Spain, not literally on the Ark. So did any of these groups actually preserve knowledge from a civilization before ours? There's no hard evidence that they did. But within the frame of this story, multiple resets, fragments surviving, symbols functioning as hard drives, secret societies become a proposed mechanism. A how for people who think more survived than we can prove. Because look at what does persist across centuries of esoteric practice, a fixation on initiation as a way of compressing knowledge into experience. Carefully maintained rituals repeated generation after generation with almost obsessive precision even when the outer world changes. Recurring symbolic toolkits, pillars, ladders, compasses, eyes, serpents, stars that echo older temple iconography and mythic motifs. An insistence that the deepest truths are dangerous if broadcast too widely, but life-saving when handled correctly. All of that is exactly what you would invent if you believed the world periodically burned down, and that your job was not to stop the fire, but to make sure a few seeds made it through the ash. This is where belief and evidence stop holding hands. Historians point to concrete, recent origins. Esotericists point to mythic timelines and say, the thread is older than the documents. The truth may be much more modest than either extreme. Scattered insights about astronomy, geometry, psychology, and human transformation, rediscovered in different ages, then wrapped in stories of an unbroken chain to give them authority and drama. But whether or not any lodge or order truly goes back to a lost world, the pattern matters. Small initiated groups, symbols that outlive languages, rituals that turn abstract ideas into embodied memory, myths of survival and reconstruction after great endings. If we are not the first civilization to walk this path, this is one of the ways previous walkers might have tried to leave us a map, not in straight prose on a page that can burn, but in living codes carried by people, handed from voice to ear, from teacher to student, from one reset to the next. And that takes us to an even older technology than temples and lodges, one that doesn't need stone or parchment at all. The human voice. Imagine a world with no books, no hard drives, no cloud. Your only backup system is people, voices, breath, memory. For most of human history, that was it. If something mattered where the water was, which plants would kill you. When the stars signaled danger, it had to live in human minds or it didn't live at all. That sounds fragile, but it's not as fragile as you'd think, because humans invented a survival technology that's older than any temple and more portable than any secret society. Story. Not once upon a time bedtime story. Story as operating system. Story as encryption. Story as the way you hide hard data in a former child can remember 70 years later. Anthropologists see this over and over. Aboriginal Australian cultures have songlines, epic chants that map the landscape in sound. On the surface, they're mythic journeys of ancestral beings crossing the land in the dreaming. Underneath their GPS, a verse might describe a spirit emu stumbling, bleeding, resting, turning, all at specific rock outcrops, waterholes and paths. To sing the song correctly, you have to walk it. To walk it correctly, you have to sing it. Miss a verse and you get lost. Sing it right and you can cross hundreds of kilometers of harsh terrain without a map. When Western researchers finally started checking these myths against geology and archaeology, something unnerving showed up. Some coastal groups preserve stories of the sea coming in, swallowing former hunting grounds, drowning river mouths, turning hills into islands. They talk about landmarks out there under the water that you can't see anymore. Sea level rise after the last ice age did exactly that. Not 10 generations ago, 10,000 years ago or more. When geologists plotted those oral accounts against reconstructions of paleo shorelines, in some cases they matched events that would have happened 7,000 to 10,000 years in the past. The conservative interpretation is that the stories have been updated and re-anchored over time. The bolder reading is that, under the right conditions, oral tradition can carry a memory for longer than any empire has existed. And it's not just Australia. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous stories describe great shaking, the ocean withdrawing, then a wall of water rushing in and swallowing whole villages. For a long time they were filed by outsiders under tribal legend. Then geologists dated a massive Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and tsunami to around 1700 CE. Japanese records from the same year mention an orphan tsunami with no local quake. The oral histories and the tectonic evidence lined up. In India, some coastal communities tell of ancient cities taken by the sea, temples whose tops can still be seen when the tides are low and the water is clear. Offshore surveys near places like Mahabalipuram and Dwarka have found submerged structures exactly where the stories said they'd be. So how does memory do this without writing? It cheats. It uses every trick in the brain's book, repetition. Rhythm, rhyme, alliteration, formulaic phrases, expected patterns. You can't ask a non-literate herder to recite a 200-page prose document from memory. But you can absolutely train a bard to perform a 20-hour epic poem, line for line, with only minor variations, if that poem is built like a memory palace. Ancient Greek rhapsodes did this with Homer. Vedic priests in India did it with thousands of lines of ritual verses that had to be recited perfectly, vowel length and pitch included. Medieval griots in West Africa still carry genealogies, treaties and histories of entire peoples in their heads, locked into rhythm and melody. Many cultures also used the landscape itself as a mnemonic device. A certain cliff is where the sky god split the earth, also where the safe pass through the mountain lies. A carved stone is the seat of the ancestor, also a marker for when the river will flood. The myth makes the place unforgettable. The place keeps the myth anchored. Objects work the same way. Andean quipu, bundes of knotted cords, probably encoded numerical data, but some researchers suspect they also carried narrative cues. Australian message sticks, carved with distinctive markings, prompt a trained messenger to deliver a standard speech. In some traditions, carved poles, masks or bundles are not just art, they're cue sheets for specialists who know how to read them aloud. The point isn't just to entertain, it's to warn. Catastrophe myths, floods, fires from the sky, ages of darkness, may function as long-term hazard markers. Don't build your village below this line on the rock. Once, the water reached here. Don't cut down those sacred trees on the hill. When you anger that spirit, the wind comes and the sea follows. If you're a pre-scientific culture facing events that only happen every few thousand years, a mega tsunami, a volcanic super-eruption, you have two options. You can forget and let your descendants walk back into the trap, or you can burn it into their imagination so deeply that even if they no longer remember the original event, they still obey the taboo. That's what myth is really good at, compared to this. Writing is both stronger and weaker. On one hand, once you scratch marks into clay or carve them into stone, they can outlast the storyteller. Cuneiform tablets buried in Mesopotamian ruins survived 4,000 years. The pyramid texts are still legible on limestone. On the other hand, writing is brittle. It clusters in archives, temples, libraries, single points of failure. Burn the Library of Alexandria, and an entire continent's written memory goes up in smoke. Let a script fall out of use, and in a few generations no one can read it. Oral tradition is different. It's messy, mutable, vulnerable to drift. But it's also distributed. As long as there's a living chain of speakers and listeners, the story can leap across geography, political collapse, even language shifts. Parts mutate, the core can persist. If the world really has gone through cycles of destruction and rebuilding, it's not hard to imagine that most written records from previous rounds vaporized with their stone cities and data centers. What survives is what can be carried under open sky, constellations turned into heroes. Ocean level changes turned into dragon floods. Meteor impacts remembered as spears of fire from angry gods. Those flood and reset myths we keep bumping into from Sumer to India to the Americas might not be detailed historical reports, but they may be echoes of events that were terrifying enough and explained through story cleverly enough to keep reverberating in human memory long after the last carved tablet dissolved. Myth, in that sense, is not the opposite of history. It's history run through the compression algorithm of the human nervous system. Memory surviving not on paper or silicon, but on tongues. And if myths can carry warnings across 10,000 years, what else have they been carrying? That question takes us to another pattern that shows up wherever humans tell stories of sky and earth meeting, the world tree, the cosmic axis, the idea that there is a central pillar connecting all the layers of reality. Everywhere you look, some version of that pillar shows up. In the frozen north, the Norse called it Yggdrasil, the ash tree whose roots twist down into the realm of the dead, whose trunk stands in the world of men, and whose branches arch up into Asgard, the home of the gods. At its base, a dragon gnaws the roots. Up above, an eagle sits in the high branches. A squirrel runs insults back and forth between them. It sounds like a fantasy ecosystem, but structurally it's simple: underworld below, human world in the middle, heavens above, all locked together by a single living axis. Half a world away, the ancient Maya imagined something strikingly similar. They had the Ceiba, the world tree, with its roots in Zeebolba, the underworld, its trunk rising through the earthly plane, and its crown stretching into the upper worlds. In some depictions from the classic period, that tree stands at the centre of the cosmos, with the Milky Way arcing behind it like a luminous backbone. The gods perch in its branches. Serpents coil along its trunk. Then you go into Siberia. Many shamanic peoples there talk about a great tree or pole rising at the centre of the world. A shaman in trance climbs it in stages, moving through branches that correspond to different heavens, meeting spirits along the way, sometimes descending into the lower realms along the roots. Actual ritual poles or carved trees get set up in the village as stand-ins for that cosmic trunk. You find the same basic pattern in Central Asia, in some native North American traditions, in parts of Africa, even encoded in Indo-European myth, where a sacred oak or pillar marks the navel of the world. Different trees, different animals, different gods. Same diagram. 3 levels of reality. 1 vertical connector. Anthropologists call this the axis mundi, the world axis, the cosmic spine. Religions and mythologies hang different ornamentation on it, but the bones are familiar. Sometimes it's not a tree at all. Mount Meru in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology is a sacred mountain at the literal and symbolic centre of the world, anchoring the universe. The Greek Olympus is the peak where gods and men intersect. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats, tiered temple towers, were built as artificial mountains, stairways where heaven and earth could meet. The Kaaba in Mecca, the Omphalos stone at Delphi, the Benben stone in ancient Egypt, each one functions in its own symbolic system as a world centre, a place where the vertical line between above, here and below is unusually thin. It's the same geometry over and over again, a point that is the middle of everything, a line that ties the layers together. Now, you could call this obvious. Humans stand upright. We see sky above, ground below. Trees and mountains are big, vertical and impressive. So of course we project meaning onto that arrangement. But there's a wrinkle. Norse sailors, Maya astronomer priests, Siberian reindeer herders, and sub-Saharan ritual specialists were not swapping TikToks. As far as we know, many of these traditions developed in isolation, separated by oceans, deserts, and tens of thousands of years. Yet if you strip away the local costumes, they seem to be remembering the same architecture. That's led some researchers to wonder if the world tree is not just about trees, but about the sky. Think about what the night looked like before light pollution, before cities, before neon, before satellites. You'd look up and see the stars wheeling around a fixed point in the sky, the celestial pole. The constellations rise and set, the Milky Way tilts and turns, but that pivot point just sits there, night after night, year after year. If you track it with a stick or pole, it really does feel like the universe is turning around a vertical axis driven into the earth. Now add the Milky Way, a glowing river or band cutting across the sky. A huge branching luminous arc. Put those 2 observations together and you get a natural template for a world tree, a vertical celestial axis at the pole, intersected by a bright branching band that looks uncannily like a cosmic trunk and limbs. Some scholars have even suggested that myths of the falling or broken world tree could encode slow changes in the sky over thousands of years, as the position of the pole star shifts with the precession cycle. Others point to much more down-to-earth symbolism. In village life, the central pole of a tent, the hearth pillar of a longhouse, or the main mast of a ship literally holds the world you live in together. Ritual posts where sacrifices are made, or where prisoners are bound, become the focus of communal attention and power. It isn't a leap from everything important happens around this pole to, this is the point where our world connects to the others. Sacred mountains and temple towers do the same job in stone. Babel, Meru, Olympus, the stepped pyramids at Teotihuacan and Giza, each one claims in its own way to be the place where Earth reaches up and touches the sky. Pilgrims climb toward the gods. Priests descend into crypts that double as entrances to the underworld. The building itself embodies the axis. So what are we looking at here? Is this just convergent symbolism? Lots of cultures independently arriving at the same basic image because the human body and landscape are arranged the way they are? Or is there something older hiding underneath? If there really were cycles of destruction and rebuilding, if earlier civilizations watched the sky with obsessive precision because their survival depended on it, you'd expect some of their core ideas to leak forward through myth. Not blueprints, not technical manuals, diagrams, a way of saying the universe has a structure. There is a center. There is an up and a down and a through line that links them. And what happens at that center ripples through all the layers. The world tree, the axis mundi, might be one of those diagrams. A memory not of a specific event, like a flood or a fire from the sky, but of a worldview, that everything is connected along a vertical spine, and that if you understand that spine, whether astronomically, spiritually, or technologically, you understand how worlds are born, destroyed, and remade. And once you start seeing that spine, the next pattern jumps out at you. The numbers that keep clustering around these cosmic diagrams, 7s and 12s and other strange counts that show up in myths, temples, and star lore from one end of the planet to the other. Start with the obvious ones, 7 days of creation in Genesis, 7 heavens in Islamic cosmology, 7 sages in India and Mesopotamia, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 churches in the Book of Revelation, 7 rishis in Hindu myth, mapped onto 7 stars in the Big Dipper. Then 12 tribes of Israel, 12 Olympian gods, 12 imams in Shia Islam, 12 months in most traditional calendars, 12 animals in the Chinese zodiac, 12 Adityas in the Vedas, 12 knights around Arthur's Round Table if you listen to later medieval tradition, and lurking in the background, a stranger number 40. 40 days of the biblical flood, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days of fasting for Moses, for Elijah, for Jesus, 40 days between resurrection and ascension, in Islam, 40 days for the soul between death and the next stage. In some Eastern Orthodox traditions, prayers at 40 days. In old Mesopotamian texts, gods associated with the number 40 as a unit of completion. Why these numbers? Why not 9 days of creation, or 13 main gods, or 37 days of purifying rain? This is where you see myth and math start to blur. Ancient people weren't just picking numbers out of a hat, they were counting things. Days between moon phases, stars that didn't move, conjunctions of visible planets, intervals in the flood season, repetitions in ritual. Take 12 first because it's the least mysterious. You look up and track the sun's yearly path against the background of stars. You notice that different constellations rise with the dawn over the course of the year. You divide that circle up. 12 equal slices is a very practical choice. 12 divides nicely into 2, 3, 4, and 6. The Babylonians built an entire base 60 number system out of that logic. 12 times 5 gives you 60. From them we inherit 12 months, 24 hours, 60 minutes, 360 degrees of a circle. Once 12 is the backbone of your calendar and your geometry, it stops being just a count. It becomes a symbol of order, completeness, the full cycle. So when you tell a story about gods or tribes or disciples, and you want to say, this is the complete set, 12 is sitting there, loaded with meaning, waiting to be used. 7 is trickier. 7 is not especially friendly mathematically. In a base 10 system, it doesn't divide cleanly into much. But if you're watching the sky without telescopes, it jumps out in other ways. The ancients counted 7 wanderers moving against the fixed stars: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Those 7 lights become 7 planetary gods in Mesopotamia. 7 ruling powers, 7 archangels, 7 days of the week, each one linked to a planet. The Babylonians already had a 7-day cycle tied to the phases of the moon. By the time it filters down into Jewish and then Christian tradition, it fuses with the creation story and becomes the template for sacred time itself. Look at the moon more closely, and another pattern appears. From new moon to half is about 7 days. From half to full, another 7. Full back to half 7. Half to dark 7. Roughly 29.5 days broken into 4 quarters of about 7 days each. A convenient rhythm for markets, rest days, rituals. You don't need a stone-carved calendar if you can just look up. Now step into India. The 7 rishis, the seers who preserve and transmit primordial knowledge, are identified with the stars of Ursa Major. The 7 higher lokas, or worlds, and 7 lower ones map a vertical cosmology that rhymes with the 7 heavens of the Near East. In later yoga and tantric traditions, 7 chakras climb the spine like miniature worlds along an inner axis mundi. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra is warned by a god, who himself is tied into a network of sacred numbers used for temple dimensions, star lists, and ritual offerings. Some ziggurats are built in 7 stages. In the Bible, Jericho's walls fall after 7 priests march around them for 7 days blowing 7 trumpets. Different religions, different rituals, same numbers woven into the structure. 40 plays a different role. It's not about the architecture of the sky so much as the architecture of time and transformation. In many traditions, 40 becomes just long enough for a complete change of state, long enough for floodwaters to wash a world clean, for a generation to die off in the wilderness, for a fast to strip a person down to nothing and rebuild them. Some scholars point out that around 6 lunar months is about 177 days, 4 sets of roughly 40-odd days marking agricultural and ritual phases. Others note that rainfall cycles, gestation periods, and mourning customs tended to cluster in similar ranges. Whatever its exact origin, 40 becomes shorthand for ordeal and reset. Underneath all this is what you might call the mathematics of myth. You don't need a blackboard full of equations to encode a worldview. You can do it with counts and cycles, with 7s and 12s and 40s that link your calendar to your temple, your sky law to your social structure. Babylonian priests tracking Jupiter's 12-year cycle. Hebrew scribes structuring history into 40-year blocks. Vedic poets singing hymns to 7 flames and 12 suns. Chinese astrologers dividing time into 12 earthly branches. Across the board, number becomes a way to say, this is not random. There is pattern here, which brings us back to the idea of, we are the 7th civilization. Look through the lens of these traditions, and 7 is almost never about a single event. It's about a sequence, 7 days, to create a world. 7 heavens stacked above each other, 7 world ages in some esoteric Christian and Islamic schemes, 7 suns in certain Buddhist texts, each one rising and burning the world in turn. If older civilizations really did rise and fall in cycles, whether through natural cataclysms, human self-destruction, or some combination, you'd expect the survivors to remember the rhythm more easily than the details. Numbers are portable. You can lose your cities and still keep your 7s and 12s in songs and rituals. So when a modern narrative talks about us being in the 7th iteration, it might be pure metaphor. It might be New Age recycling, or it might be echoing a very old intuition, half-remembered and heavily mythologized, that worlds come in numbered sets, that there is a count, and that we are much further along in that count than we like to admit. And if that's true, the next question writes itself. What happens when you reach the end of the series? For a long time, the official story went like this. Ancient people told wild tales about world ages, floods, fire from the sky, and lost lands. Interesting psychologically, important for religion and culture, but not to be taken literally. The grown-ups in the room, geologists, archaeologists, historians, would pat the myths on the head and get back to their nice linear timelines. Then the data started getting awkward. Take the Younger Dryas again. Before the impact hypothesis, most geologists were comfortable with the idea of slow, gradual climate change. Yes, there were ice ages and interglacials, but the tempo was thought to be relatively gentle. Then cores from Greenland ice sheets and lake sediments said otherwise. They showed a world flipping from near-modern warmth back into glacial chill in a matter of decades, maybe even years, around 12,900 years ago. Temperatures plummeting, ecosystems collapsing, megafauna dying out, sea levels jerking up in pulses rather than gliding smoothly. If you're an ancient culture trying to process that, what do you say? You don't talk about abrupt shifts in the North Atlantic thermohaline circulation. You say the age ended. You say the sky gods were angry. You say the world drowned and began again. For years, the idea that an actual cosmic impact might have kicked that chaos off was treated as fringe. Then came layers of black matte in multiple continents, laced with microspherules, nanodiamonds, and elevated platinum, signatures that, in other contexts, we are happy to associate with impacts and high-energy events. The debate is still very active, and not everyone is convinced, but the Overton window moved. Sudden catastrophe was back on the table as a serious mechanism. Meanwhile, archaeology began tripping over sites that shouldn't exist. Göbekli Tepe, intricate megalithic architecture from around 9600 BCE, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. A temple from a time when, according to the old model, humans were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, just figuring out farming. Other sites in Anatolia and the Levant now hint at organized, settled communities earlier than anyone expected. Off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Americas, sonar and divers keep finding what look like submerged structures sitting on land that was dry before sea levels spiked after the Ice Age. None of this proves an advanced lost civilization. But it does force a rewrite of the straight-line story. Small bands, then farming, then villages, then cities. Instead we see experiments, collapses, regional fluorescences, resets. More like waves than a rising staircase. The pattern repeats in other domains. Ancient medical texts from India, China, and Greece describe surgical procedures, herbal combinations, and diagnostic systems that modern researchers are only now validating in clinical trials. Not all of it holds up, but enough does that pharmaceutical companies quietly comb through traditional knowledge databases looking for leads. In astronomy, the precision of some ancient observations is no longer easily hand-waved away. The precession of the equinoxes in Vedic and Hellenistic traditions. lunar and planetary cycles encoded in Babylonian texts with a level of accuracy that implies long-term systematic observation. Debates rage over just how early some of this was known, but the old caricature of stargazing priests making up stories in the sand doesn't fit the evidence. Engineering tells a similar story. Roman concrete that outperforms many modern mixes in marine environments. Incan masonry fitting polygonal blocks so tightly you can't slide a blade of grass between them. Surviving earthquakes that level modern buildings. Ancient water management systems, canats, stepwells, complex terracing that solved problems we're still struggling with in arid regions today. Again, none of this means laser-wielding Atlanteans. It does mean we've consistently underestimated how much you can figure out with patient observation, long memory, and a cultural obsession with pattern. Carbon dating and genetic research add another twist. Radiocarbon calibration curves have been revised repeatedly as we've learned more about fluctuations in atmospheric C14. Each revision nudges timelines, sometimes by centuries. Sites once confidently dated to one era slide backward or forward. Genetic clocks tell us that major population splits, migrations, and bottlenecks happened at times that don't always line up neatly with the old archaeological layers. Denisovan DNA at high altitudes, Neanderthal introgression in unexpected regions, ghost lineages hinted at in African genomes. When you combine this with the growing catalogue of abrupt climate events, Heinrich events, Dansgaard, Ushka oscillations, volcanic winters, you start to see something that looks uncomfortably like what myth has been insisting all along. Not one smooth ascent, but a series of lurches. Calm, then crisis. Expansion, then contraction. Stability, then reset. Inside the sciences, there's been a quiet philosophical shift. The old uniformitarian slogan, "The present is the key to the past," hasn't been abandoned, but it's been amended. Catastrophes are no longer taboo. Planet-scale impacts, supervolcanoes, rapid sea level jumps, solar storms that could wipe out electrical infrastructure today, all are discussed in journals and risk assessments. Some researchers even model long-term cycles in solar activity, orbital dynamics, and geomagnetic behavior, and ask uncomfortable questions about their timing. From the outside, it can look like science is finally proving what the ancients said. That's not quite right. What's really happening is that the data are expanding, and some of the patterns the ancients encoded in stories and numbers now rhyme with patterns we can measure. That rhyme should probably make us a little humble. Because if our predecessors could preserve fragments of real events across thousands of years, through myth, ritual, sacred numbers and sky lore, what else did they know that we've forgotten? How many cycles have already played out on this planet, written not in textbooks, but in drowned coastlines and erased forests and the faint, stubborn memories of worlds before this one? And if science is only now catching up to a few of those whispers, what does that say about where we really stand in the long count? Which leads to an unsettling possibility. If the record does show pulses of destruction and renewal, if both myth and measurement hint at recurring upheaval, then the obvious question is not just what happened before. It's whether another turn of the wheel is coming, so is it. If you line up the ancient warnings and the modern spreadsheets, the picture isn't neat, but it's not comforting either. Start with the star we orbit. Solar physicists track the sun's 11-year cycle of activity, sunspots, flares, coronal mass ejections. But layered on top of that shorter rhythm are longer, less understood cycles, grand maxima and minima, that last centuries, maybe millennia. We know from ice cores and tree rings that the sun has gone through quiet phases like the Maunder minimum and hyperactive phases that bathed Earth in high-energy particles. In 1859, a big flare, what we now call the Carrington event, hit our magnetosphere and lit telegraph lines on fire. If something like that struck today, with billions of devices, satellites and transformers wired into a single global nervous system, the damage wouldn't just be a few burned messages. Serious studies talk about continent-scale blackouts lasting months, maybe years, cascading failures in water, food and medicine. Not the end of the species, but very possibly the end of the civilization we currently recognize. Then there's Earth's own shield, the magnetic field. It's not fixed. It wanders, weakens, strengthens, and occasionally flips north, becoming south, and vice versa. Geologists have mapped these reversals in volcanic rocks like tree rings in stone. Full flips are rare on human timescales, but there are also excursions, partial collapses or lurches in the field that can last centuries. The last Champ event around 42,000 years ago is one example being actively studied. During these times, with a weaker shield, more radiation reaches the surface and the upper atmosphere, potentially messing with climate, biology, and any technology that relies on satellites and high-altitude flight. We're currently in a period of magnetic weakening and rapid pole drift. Some researchers argue it could be the early phase of an excursion or reversal. Others say fluctuations like this have happened before without catastrophe. Nobody can say with certainty where this particular wobble leads. Overlay all of that with the thing we are definitely doing, altering the climate. Here, the science isn't speculative. Carbon dioxide levels, methane, nitrous oxide, greenhouse gases are rising fast. Global average temperatures are climbing. Ice sheets are destabilizing. The oceans are warming and acidifying. Models differ on exact timing and local details, but the general direction is clear: a sharp, human-driven departure from Holocene stability. When paleoclimatologists look back at intervals of rapid warming, abrupt sea level rise, and disrupted circulation patterns, they often find ecological turnover and cultural stress. Not usually asteroid impact levels of destruction, more often long grinding pressure that helps push already fragile societies over the edge. History gives us case studies. Before the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean saw a cluster of stresses: droughts, earthquakes, famines, migrations. Letters from the time talk about grain shortages, failing harvests. The enemy ships are burning our cities. Trade networks that had tied Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenae, and smaller polities into one interdependent system snapped. Writing disappeared from some regions for centuries. The survivors remembered it later as an age of dark invaders and angry gods. The so-called late antique Little Ice Age likely kicked off in part by massive volcanic eruptions in the 6th century CE, coincides with plagues, political fragmentation, and mass movements of people from Europe to Asia. The classic Maya collapse, the fall of Angkor, episodes of Chinese dynastic turnover all line up, at least roughly, with regional climate swings, prolonged droughts or floods layered on top of internal political and economic tensions. In each case, there isn't one culprit, it's a stack. Environmental stress, over-complex systems, inequality, bad decision-making, bad luck. But the pattern is familiar. Long periods of expansion and confidence. Then warning signs, crop failures, resource depletion, elite infighting, brittle over-centralization. Then some external shock arrives. A volcano, a drought, a pandemic, an invasion, and the system can't bend anymore. It snaps. Modern thinkers have tried to formalize this rhythm. Cyclical historians like Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century, or more recently Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee, saw empires growing, aging and dying in recognizable phases. Economists and political scientists talk about long cycles, Kondrativ waves in technology and economics, Strauss-Howe generational turnings, Turchin's models of secular cycles in population, inequality and instability. These frameworks don't all agree, and none have perfect predictive power, but many of them converge on an uncomfortable idea: complex societies tend to overshoot. They grow into periods of strain, ignore signals, then hit a correction. Sometimes mild, sometimes brutal. When you put that next to the ancient talk of Yugas, suns, worlds and ages, the resonance is hard to ignore. They warned of times when humans would become arrogant, forget sacred laws, exploit the earth, and lose their connection to each other. Times when technology outpaced wisdom, when societies valued accumulation over balance. In those myths, the reset doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes at the end of a moral and ecological arc. Today, our existential risk lists read differently, less about divine judgment, more about probabilities. Nuclear war, engineered pandemics, runaway AI misalignment, biosphere collapse, solar storms, geomagnetic failure, supervolcanoes, asteroids and comets. Each has its own likelihood curve, its own mitigation strategies. But taken together, they amount to a secular version of the same anxiety. We've built a very tall, very intricate tower on a planet that occasionally shakes. Are we due for another reset in the strict, mechanistic sense? No one can say that with scientific confidence. Some proposed cosmic or geomagnetic cycles remain speculative. The timing of big eruptions and impacts is probabilistic, not clockwork. Climate projections map ranges and scenarios, not fixed dates. But we can say this: we are living in a period of unprecedented global interconnection, with known stressors accumulating inside a natural system that has produced abrupt changes before. If a major shock hits, whether from above, below, or from our own hands, it will hit a civilization that is, in some ways, incredibly resilient, and in others, incredibly fragile. That circles us back to the question the ancients seemed obsessed with, and that modern risk researchers quietly echo. If history does rhyme with itself, if not in exact cycles, then in recurring patterns of rise, hubris, stress, and correction, then maybe the most important question isn't whether we can prevent every possible reset. It's what we choose to make non-negotiable. If another wave comes, slow or sudden, what do we insist on carrying through it? What knowledge, what values, what stories, what tools do we want waiting on the other side, in the hands of whoever has to start the game again? Because something always survives. The real mystery, as we look back at the 6 civilizations before us, and forward into whatever's coming, is how to decide what deserves to be part of the 7th and beyond. So let's look at what actually did make it through. Not the bricks, not the palaces, those always crumble. Look instead at the things that keep resurfacing, no matter which age, continent or pantheon you're staring at. We've walked through a lot of them. The idea that time isn't a straight line but a wheel, the Hindu Yugas, the Hopi worlds, the Aztec suns, the Egyptian first time that can be re-entered. Different languages, different theologies, same basic rhythm. Ages of rising complexity and disconnection, followed by a fall, followed by renewal. The same core symbols circling that idea like satellites. A world tree or cosmic axis tying heaven, earth and underworld together. A serpent or dragon guarding thresholds, coiled at the roots winding across the sky, or lurking in the depths. Sacred mountains, sacred centres, temples built to echo constellations and solstices. Numbers that keep turning up in myths and monuments. 4, 7, 12, sometimes 72 or 432, woven into calendars, gods, measures of time. The same architectural obsessions. Megaliths that outlast empires. Stone circles tuned to equinoxes. Pyramids that encode star positions and cardinal directions. Cyclopean blocks at Baalbek or Puma Punku that seem to have been carved with an almost unreasonable precision for their supposed era. Göbekli Tepe, standing at the dawn of agriculture. Already fully formed, already astronomical, as if someone brought a finished template into a world that wasn't supposed to have it yet. And layered on top of all that, the same strategies for keeping knowledge alive when things fall apart. Esoteric schools guarding geometry, astronomy, and metaphysics under layers of initiation. Priesthoods and mystery cults. Later, secret societies and hermetic orders. And underneath even them, something older and more resilient, oral tradition. Stories sung and recited, genealogies memorized, rituals repeated, myths told around fires for thousands of nights in a row. Taken one by one, you can explain any of these as coincidence, convergence, or human pattern seeking. Of course, different cultures notice the stars. Of course, serpents are scary and powerful. Of course, people like round numbers, but when you stack them together, the cyclical ages, the flood memories, the axis mundi, the serpent, the sacred numbers, the astronomically tuned stones, the persistent geometry and proportion, it stops feeling like random dots and starts looking like a sketch. Not a photograph, not proof, but an outline of something that's been carried forward again and again. If you ask which survivors are the hardest to wave away, a few stand out. Flood myths that line up loosely with real post-glacial sea level rise and sudden climate swings. Megalithic sites that seem, at minimum, to preserve a very old, very careful sky-watching tradition. The recurrence of specific numbers that match astronomical cycles and precessional periods with unnerving accuracy. And above all, the stubborn global fixation on the idea that we are not the first, that there were worlds, ages, or peoples before us who rose, fell, and left only fragments behind. You can read all of that conservatively. Maybe each reset is just a regional collapse. Maybe world means our valley, our kingdom, our sea. Maybe the survivors we're tracking are simply clever farmers, sailors, and priests passing along whatever worked, dressing it in myth to make people listen. But even in that modest version, the inheritance is real, and it's still shaping us. Religion takes those fragments and turns them into origin stories and apocalypses. Science picks up the same questions. How old is the world? How stable is the climate? What happens when systems tip? And answers them with equations instead of gods. Culture keeps retelling the pattern in novels, movies, and games. Golden ages, catastrophes, reboots, chosen survivors. Underneath the surface differences, we're still doing what those bottlenecked ancestors did after their own near extinction. Watching the sky, tracking the seasons, arguing about what time it is in the story of the world, and trying to decide what must not be lost. So what does it mean if part of us already assumes we're the seventh civilization, not the first? If the myths, symbols, numbers and stones are all whispering the same thing, that we are inheritors, not originators, how does that change the way we see ourselves, our technology, our responsibilities to whoever might come after us? Because if something always survives, then the real question quietly becomes, what are we, right now, engraving into the part of humanity that does not die with any single reset? That's where we'll end this journey, not in the past, but with the thread in our hands and the choice of what to weave into whoever is waiting on the far side of the next bend. So let's be brave enough to actually say what we've been circling. The seventh civilization isn't necessarily a vanished super empire with crystal power plants and anti-gravity tech. It might be simpler, and in a way, much stranger than that. It might be that what really repeats is not a specific culture, but a pattern. A long build-up of complexity, a period of overreach, a shock to the system, sometimes local, sometimes global. Collapse, forgetting, and then slowly the climb back up. Each time, the physical stuff gets wiped or buried. Each time, a few threads slip through, a handful of symbols, a handful of numbers, a map of the sky, a way of measuring time, a story about a flood or a fire or a darkness, a teaching about how humans should live, because once, when they didn't, everything fell apart. Those are the things that seem to survive every reset, whether you read the evidence conservatively or lean into the more radical possibilities. The Yugas and world ages that say this has happened before. The myths of four worlds, five suns, previous humanities wiped off the board. The global flood traditions that echo real sea level rise and climate whiplash. The obsession with precession, solstices, equinoxes, the slow wobble of the planet turned into sacred calendars. The stones that won't fall down, the geometry that keeps reappearing, the serpents, trees, axes and sacred centres that refuse to die. And behind them, the same quiet strategy. Encode your knowledge where chaos has the hardest time reaching it. In stories, in rituals, in initiation, in proportions. In alignments, in numbers that are easy to memorize and hard to erase. That's the core idea we've been exploring. Not a single Atlantis-style civilization that rose and fell once, but a recurring cultural instinct to build upward, to get hit, to fall, and to try, desperately, to send a message forward through the fire. You can keep it humble and say these are just echoes of regional collapses. Bronze Age trade networks shattering, river kingdoms flooding, volcanic winters starving empires. Or you can entertain the possibility that there were earlier cycles we barely remember at all. Ice Age coastlines now under 120 meters of water, mountain cultures scoured by glaciers, knowledge packets handed from one remnant to the next like a relay baton. Either way, the pattern is the same. People notice that the world is not as stable as it looks. They try to map that instability, mythologically, mathematically, architecturally. They wrap their maps in symbol and story so they outlive libraries and hard drives. And then, when the next wave comes, most of it drowns, but not all. The question that matters is not, did a perfect high-tech global civilization exist 12,000 years ago? The question that matters is, why does so much of our surviving ancient memory insist that civilizations are fragile, that time is cyclical, and that certain kinds of knowledge are worth carrying across the breaks? Because here we are in our own moment on that wheel. For the first time in known history, we have a global nervous system. Satellites, fiber optics, real-time communication across continents. We can watch ice sheets carving in high definition. We can measure atmospheric chemistry down to parts per million. We can simulate futures on supercomputers. We can also destroy more in a day than most ancient disasters could touch in a century. We like to think that makes us immune to the kind of resets our ancestors mythologized. But if you step back and look at the big picture, the similarities are uncomfortable. We've built a civilization that spans the planet, but depends on fragile infrastructures, supply chains, data centers, power grids, highly specialized agriculture. We're pushing climate systems that, in the deep record, have flipped fast and hard. We're compressing resources, destabilizing ecosystems, concentrating power and information into fewer and fewer nodes. That is exactly the kind of arrangement that doesn't like shocks. So, recognizing this old pattern, rise, overshoot, reset isn't just an intellectual game. It's a mirror. If earlier cultures watched their worlds drown, burn, freeze or fracture, and then spent thousands of years whispering, "This can happen again," what does it mean that we've mostly stopped listening to them? Or that when we do listen, we file those warnings under myth and entertainment instead of cultural memory of failure modes? Try this thought experiment. Imagine a descendant civilization 20,000 years from now, digging through whatever is left of our age. Maybe the coastlines are different. Maybe the climate has swung in ways we can't predict. Maybe they live in small, resilient polities with long memories of a time when people tried to run the planet as one system and it didn't work. What would they actually find from us? Not the cloud. Not the ephemeral media. Those are as perishable as papyrus in a floodplain. They'd find stone. They'd find some metals, some plastics turned into weird geological layers. They might find a few deep archives if they're lucky. But more importantly, they'd find whatever we decide to embed at the same level the ancients did, in stories, in rituals, in symbols, in math, that a child can memorize without a server farm. They'd find what we believed about who we are and where we sit in the cycle. So the recognition of these repeating patterns isn't about proving some conspiracy of hidden super tech. It's about asking, if humanity really does move in waves, if there are civilizational bottlenecks and partial resets, and long stretches of rebuilding, what responsibilities do we have as one more crest on that ocean? What are we choosing to carry forward? Are we only exporting our most fragile, energy-hungry ways of living to every corner of the globe? Or are we also refining, protecting, and transmitting things that can actually survive a rough patch? Philosophies, sciences, arts, ethics, cosmologies that don't require endless growth to make sense? Our ancestors, whether Ice Age hunters or priest astronomers, seem to have agreed on at least one thing. Some knowledge matters enough to encode in myth, in stone, in sacred number. They didn't waste their hardest-won insights on trivia. Maybe the cyclical ages aren't just doom cycles. Maybe they're instruction manuals. They're saying there will be times of expansion and times of contraction. There will be floods and fires and quiet long declines. Don't stake everything on the good weather. Don't forget the sky. Don't forget that you are temporary, but the pattern is not. And now we're back to us, sitting here in the early 21st century with nuclear stockpiles, climate models, particle colliders, and globalized myth industries pumping out stories to billions of people at once. In the language of the Yugas, the worlds, the suns, the first times, where are we? Are we at the end of an age, overloaded with information and short on wisdom, standing on a thin ledge of stability? Are we in a transition, a kairos moment where small choices cascade across centuries? Are we at the beginning of something vast and unprecedented, finally stepping out of the rinse and repeat cycle? Or are we exactly where so many old myths quietly place their protagonists, at the hinge, after a long ascent before a break, with just enough awareness to realize that how we act now decides what, if anything, makes it through? That's the question I want to leave you with. If you assume, even as a thought experiment, that we are not the first high-complexity civilization on this planet, that we are at least the 7th serious attempt to build something big and intricate and world-shaping, how does that change the way you look at your life? Your work, your culture, your obligations to people you will never meet, in futures you will never see. And more specifically, if some small slice of our world is going to survive whatever comes next, what do you want it to be? What ideas, what practices, what stories, what ways of relating to each other and to the planet? Because whether the next reset is a slow, grinding resource crunch, a fast climate flip, a technological misstep, or nothing more dramatic than the ordinary rise and fall of empires, something will carry through us to whoever comes after. We are already engraving their inheritance. If you've stayed with me all the way to this point, you're exactly the kind of mind I want in that conversation. So add your thread. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what you think is most worth carrying forward. Is it a scientific insight, a spiritual teaching, a piece of art? A way of organizing communities? I read what you write, and those perspectives matter more than you might think. If you want to keep exploring these questions, the cycles, the myths, the alignments between ancient stories and modern science, make sure you hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. This rabbit hole goes a lot deeper, and we're just getting started. And if you're the kind of person who likes to take these ideas on walks, drives, or late-night study sessions, the best way to support this work is by listening on Spotify. There's a link in the description. Streaming there helps the channel more than anything else, and lets me keep diving into topics most algorithms don't know what to do with. Wherever you go from here, don't stop at this video. Follow the symbols, follow the numbers, follow the stones and the stories and the strange convergences that shouldn't line up but somehow do. Maybe we are the seventh civilization. Maybe we're the first of a new kind. Either way, we've inherited a thread that has already passed through fire more than once. The real mystery now is what will tie to it, and who, thousands of years from today, will feel that tug and start asking the same questions you're asking right now.